Welcome back, hey my dear friends. Tonight we start a trip into the chilliest, bleakest, harshest winters SSC Europe ever saw. Picture a reality where temperatures plunge so severely that the Thames River turns to solid ice, where mothers die in childbirth amid the biting frost, where a single bad call in autumn means your whole household starves long before spring shows up. This is the tale of how women endured when winter wasn't merely a season, but a brutal trial of endurance, knowledge, and unity. What they faced would astonish you. What they achieved would uplift you. And what they reveal might reshape your view of today's world. So before we dive deep into this amazing account together, I want to ask you something. If this voyage into history speaks to your soul, if these women's struggles affect you, would you take a moment to subscribe to this channel? Maybe tap that like button, share this with someone who enjoys history, or leave a comment below telling me where you are tuning in from right now. Are you cozy in bed listening at night, at your desk late, or somewhere else?
I really want to know. Your backing means everything, and it lets me send you more tales like this one.
Also, if you are liking this, turn down those lights, get comfy. Maybe allow some soft ambient noise to guide you deeper into this realm. Now, let us travel back in time as one. Shut your eyes for a heartbeat. Imagine you are standing in a little village somewhere in England, around the year 1315. It's late September, and you feel it in the breeze. That early cold sting of autumn wind cutting through your wool gown. The heavens are grey, heavy with looming rain. All around, women hustle with purpose, intense purpose, because they grasp something you might not fully realize yet. Winter is on its way, and winter is not what you imagine. This is not the season of hot cocoa and snug throws. This is not the season of central heating and round-the-clock stores. This is a winter that brings death, that raw, that harsh. And the women near you, they are not just getting ready, they are battling for existence. Let me share the winter from 1315 to 1317. Scholars name it the Great Famine. I label it a horror. Some 1.5 to 3 million people perished, not from combat, not from disease, but from frost and starvation. The Little Ice Age had begun, a stretch from 1300 to 1870 when temperatures across Europe fell so sharply that rivers iced over, harvests failed, and entire settlements disappeared. Winter no longer arrived in late November and departed in early March. Now, winter took hold right after Michaelmas, September 29th, and would not loosen its grip until Candlemas, February 2nd. That is 4 months. 4 months of sub-zero temperatures, darkness, and shrinking food supplies. And who bore the harshest load? Women. Always women. Reflect on this for a moment. In medieval Europe, 90% of people dwelled in rural zones, tiny villages, remote homesteads. And women did not simply stay home cooking and tidying, like any movie might suggest. They labored in the fields beside men. They gathered grain. They looked after livestock. They spun wool for hours daily until their fingers bled. And then when they returned worn out from the fields, their real work started: cooking, scrubbing, patching clothes, minding children, readying for the next day. But winter flipped everything. In winter the fields are frozen and leafless. The animals huddled together for wool. The sun dipped by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, plunging all into darkness for 14 hours. And the women, they had to keep everyone alive. You know what's remarkable? We picture medieval existence as foolish, as primitive. But these women held wisdom that would embarrass many of us today. They understood preservation tricks we've lost. They knew which herbs could calm a fever and which could end a life. They could tell by watching the sky exactly how many days before the next blizzard. This was not backwardness. This was survival insight passed from mother to daughter for ages. Let me share a piece with you. There's a medieval poem titled Piers Plowman, written in the late 1300s. In it, the poet depicts the life of a peasant woman, and his words are unforgettable. He writes about women burdened with kids and landlords' dues, about how they spend their little money from spinning on housing, on milk and meal, to make porridge for their wailing children. And then he says something that breaks me each time I read it. He says they endure woe in winter-time, and waking at night, to rise bedside, to rock the cradle, also to card and comb wool, to patch and to launder. Woe in winter-time. Just 3 words that capture a whole universe of agony. These women would rise many times each night, not only to feed a sea, raising the baby, but to ensure the fire had not died. Because if that flame went out, everyone might freeze to death before dawn. They would check on aging parents, on ailing kids. They would add another precious log to the blaze, calculating in their minds whether they had enough fuel to last till spring. And then, because rest was a luxury they could not afford, they would sit by that flickering hearth and keep laboring, carding wool, twisting thread, mending the hole in their husband's shirt, patching their children's threadbare shoes. There was no pause, no weekends, no breaks, just survival. Now, here is what truly strikes me. These women did not just endure this alone. They built webs, systems of solidarity that contemporary society could emulate. When a woman went into labor in the depths of winter, other women would brave the freezing weather to reach her home. They would bring whatever extra food they had. They would stay for days assisting with the birth, watching the other children, running the household. This was not mere charity. This was survival through togetherness, because everyone knew that one day they would require the same help. I want you to envision something with me. Envision it is January, deep winter, the most frigid stretch of the year. You are a woman in your late 20s. You have 3 kids under 7. Your husband is out trying to hunt, hoping to bring back something, anything, to boost the dwindling reserves of salted meat and dried vegetables. You are alone in your small home, and you can see your breath even though the fire is burning. The wind whistles through cracks in the walls. The kids are hungry. They are always hungry in winter. Your youngest has a cough that terrifies you because you have seen what winter coughs can become. You have enough supplies for maybe 6 more weeks if you are extremely, extremely careful. But spring will not arrive for at least 10 weeks, perhaps 12 if it is a bad year. What do? This was the reality. This was the choice confronting millions of women each winter. And you know what? They discovered ways they stretched that food. They made broths from bones they had already boiled twice. They swapped precious eggs for a handful of grain. They scavenged for anything edible, even in the frozen terrain. They endured, but not everyone did. That is the awful truth. Not everyone lived to spring. In the winter of 1315, after harvests failed in the autumn, people began dying in November. By December, whole families were gone. By January, villages stood half empty. The chronicles from that era describe scenes that sound like horror fiction. People so desperate they gnawed bark from trees, women watching their children waste away, the elderly choosing to eat less so the young might have a chance. And you know the worst part? This was not a singular disaster, this was year after year, winter after winter, women facing this, bearing this, discovering the will to go on even when all hope seemed lost. I think about these women sometimes when I gripe about my heating bill or get annoyed that the market is out of my favorite coffee. It puts things in perspective, doesn't it? These women faced authentic adversity, life or death stakes, and they did it without the tools, the tech, the support networks we take for granted. They did it with nothing but their insight, their fortitude, and each other. Now, before we go further, I want to be clear on something. This is not a story about helpless victims. Far from it. Yes, these women endured brutal hardships. Yes, the system was rigged against them. But they were not passive. They were not weak. They were fighters. Not the kind with blades and armor, but fighters no less. They waged battles every single day just to keep their families alive, and they won more often than they lost. One of the things that amazes me most is how much these women had to know. We think of the Middle Ages as a period of ignorance, but that is our ignorance talking. These women were experts. They could name dozens of edible and medicinal plants. They grasped weather patterns. They understood animal care. They mastered complex fabric production that required years of practice to perfect. They understood nourishment in a way that let them keep people alive on very limited diets. They were birth attendants who guided women through labor without any of our modern medical tools. They were healers, teachers, organizers, workers, and so much more. And they did all of this while society told them they were beneath men, while laws blocked them from owning property in many places, while their labor was undervalued and underpaid, while they had essentially no political power or legal rights. They survived and flourished anyway. Hat is what I want you to grasp as we start this journey together. These were not simple times for simple folk. These were intricate, daunting, terrifying times. And the women who lived through them were extraordinary, not because they were superhuman, but because they refused to surrender. They adapted, they learned, they lifted each other, and they handed down their knowledge so their daughters might have a slightly better chance. You see, that is what winter truly was for these women. It was the ultimate examination, a test of everything they had learned, everything they had prepared, everything they could withstand. And here is the lovely, inspiring part. Most of them passed that test. They made it to spring. They sowed new crops. They bore more children. They sustained civilization during the darkest, coldest centuries Europe had ever known. Without these women, European society as we know it might have crumbled during the Little Ice Age.
That is not exaggeration.
That is fact. The hidden labor of millions of women day after day, winter after winter, kept everything moving, fed the kids who would become the next generation, preserved the wisdom that would eventually lead to be. Too many times, upheld the social bonds that held communities together even when all else was falling apart. So tonight, and in the nights ahead, we are going to honor these women. We are going to hear their stories, grasp their trials, appreciate their victories, and maybe, just maybe, find some motivation for our own lives in their remarkable resilience. Because here is the thing. The skills these women possessed, the knowledge they held, most of it is gone now. We do not need to know how to cure meat without refrigeration. We do not need to spin our own yarn. We have supermarkets and clothing factories, and that is wonderful. That is progress. But somewhere along the path, we also lost something precious. We lost the understanding that survival is a craft, that community is vital, that women have always been the backbone of society. Even when history volumes forgot to mention them, these women faced the worst nature could hurl at them and emerged on the other side. They did it with dignity, with power, and with each other. And their story deserves to be told. So, as we close this first chapter, I want you to sit with this image. A cold September evening in 1315, a woman standing at height. Doorway, watching the first snowflakes begin to tumble. She is frightened, how could she not be? But she is also resolved. She has done this before. She knows what must be done.
Around her, other women are doing the same, watching the snow, checking their stocks, counting their firewood, readying their hearts for the long, hard months ahead. Winter is approaching, but they are prepared. Together, they will survive. And in our next segment, we are going to see exactly how they prepared. The sprint against time that began every autumn. The incredible methods they used to make food last for months. The grueling effort of getting ready for winter. Because preparation was not just significant, it was everything. The line between existence and death. And these women, they were masters of it. Stay with me for this.
Story is just starting. Picture this. It is late August, maybe early September. The grain fields are turning golden beneath the late summer sun. Most people today would look at this scene and think, how lovely, how serene. But a medieval woman, she sees a ticking clock, a countdown, because from the moment the first leaves start to shift color, she has maybe
8 weeks, 6 weeks to gear up for 4 months of winter. 6 weeks that will decide whether her family lives or dies. Let me walk you through what those 6 weeks actually looked like, and I promise you by the end of this you will never view autumn the same way again.
The harvest began as soon as the grain was ripe, and when I say everyone helped, I mean everyone. Kids as young as 5 years old were out in the fields. Old women who could barely walk would sit and bind bundles. Pregnant women, even those who could give birth any day, were expected to work because there was simply too much to do and too little time to do it in. Women worked beside men with sickles, cutting wheat, barley, rye, and oats. Have you ever handled a sickle? I tried once at a historical reenactment, and let me tell you, after about 10 minutes, my spine was screaming and my palms were blistered. These women did this for 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours a day after day, week after week. Can you picture the physical power that required the stamina? But cutting the grain was just the start.
After cutting came bundling. After bundling came threshing, where you beat the grain to separate the seeds from
the stalks. After threshing came winnowing, where you toss the grain in baskets so the lighter chaff would blow away. Each step demanded hours of labor, and the women, they were involved in every single step. Now, here is something fascinating. Historians uncovered records showing that women and men often received the same wages for piecework during harvest. Meaning if you harvested the same amount of grain, you got paid the same regardless of gender. That almost never happened the rest of the year. But during harvest, everyone was so desperate for labor that suddenly women's work was valued equally. Kind of tells you something about how society operates, doesn't it? Value only when they absolutely need you. But let us discuss what happened after the harvest, because that is where women's work became truly critical. Every household had to calculate exactly how much food they needed for winter. Let me give you some figures that historians have estimated. An average family of 5 needed roughly 12 bushels of grain to get through winter. That is about 300 pounds of grain, just grain. That does not include vegetables, preserved meat, dried fish, or anything else. 300 pounds of grain that had to be stored properly or it would rot, attract bugs, and become useless. And who oversaw the storage? Women who checked the grain bins weekly for signs of moisture or vermin. Women who figured out how much to grind into flour each week to make sure it lasted until spring. Women. This was not simple work. This was complex resource management that would make a modern supply chain manager sweat. But grain was only part of the equation. Let me tell you about Martinmas. November 11th, the feast day of St. Martin. To medieval people, this date was as significant as Christmas or Easter, but for a completely different reason. This was the day when almost every family in Europe would slaughter most of their livestock. Why?
Think about it for a second. Winter was coming. There was no more grass or animals to graze.
Feeding livestock through winter required storing massive amounts of hay and grain, which the humans also needed. So you made a brutal calculation. How many animals do you absolutely need to keep? Usually just breeding stock and maybe a few dairy cows. Everything else they had to die. Martinmas was not a celebration. It was organized community W. I'd slaughter on a scale that would shock us today. Pigs, cattle, sheep, chickens, all killed within a few days. And then came the truly massive job, preservation. Here is where women's knowledge became absolutely crucial. You could not just stack meat in a corner and hope for the best. In the cold of winter, sure, some freezing might help, but temperatures were not consistently cold enough to rely on that alone. And one warm spell could spoil everything, leaving your family with rotting meat and no protein for months. So women used salt, huge amounts of salt. And let me tell you, salt was expensive. Salt was so valuable that people fought wars over it. Roads were built specifically to haul salt. Entire economies depended on it. A family might spend as much on salt for preservation as they did on clothes for the year. The process worked like this. First, the meat was butchered into manageable pieces. Then, women would pack it into wooden barrels with thick layers of coarse salt between each layer of meat. Not just a sprinkle. We are talking about completely coating each piece. The salt would draw out moisture, creating a brine solution that prevented bacterial growth. Some cuts were submerged directly in brine, huge vats of heavily salted water where meat could sit for months. The result, meat so salty it was almost inedible until you boiled it for hours to leach out some of that salt. This is why medieval cooking used so much boiling and so few other methods in winter. They were not bad cooks. They were dealing with preservation techniques that required long cooking times to make food palatable. Some households also used smoking, building special smokehouses or smoking sheds where meat could hang over smoldering fires for days or even weeks. The smoke would dry out the meat and coat it with compounds that prevented spoilage. Women tended these fires constantly, making sure they never went out, but also never flared up too hot, which would cook the meat instead of preserving it. Can you picture managing a fire perfectly for 2 weeks straight? The attention to detail required. But wait, there is more. Because meat and grain were not enough, you needed vegetables, vitamins, nutrients to keep diseases like scurvy at bay. Women maintained what were called kitchen gardens right next to their houses. These were not the decorative flower gardens we think of today. These were serious food production sites. Onions, leeks, carrots, beets, turnips, parsnips, cabbage, peas, beans, herbs. Anything that could grow in medieval Europe's climate and provide calories or nutrition ended up in these gardens. And women knew tricks we have forgotten. Root vegetables like carrots and beets could be stored in root cellars. Underground rooms that stayed just cool enough to prevent spoiling but not so cold that everything froze. The cellars had to be damp but not wet, ventilated but not drafty. Getting these conditions right was an art form. Other vegetables were dried, beans and peas especially. Women would harvest them, shell them, and spread them out in the sun or near the fire until they were completely dry. Dried properly, they could last years, literally years. And in a soup or stew, they would rehydrate and provide crucial protein. Then there was fruit, apples, pears, plums, cherries. Women would slice them thin and dry them, or pack them in honey, or cook them with precious sugar to make preserves. Honey was a miracle substance. Because of its natural properties, food stored in honey could last indefinitely. Women would put precious fruits, sometimes teas, into jars of honey and seal them tight. Months later, when fresh fruit was a distant memory, they could open that jar and have something sweet, something special. And let me tell you about ale and beer. You might think this was just for drinking and having fun. Ale was calories. Ale was nutrition. AE was hydration that would not make you sick the way water from a questionable source might. Women were the brewers in most medieval households. They would take barley, malt it, ferment it, and produce ale that could be stored for months. This was called small ale or small beer. Weaker than what we drink today, but safer than water and full of calories. Being a successful brewer, that could make a woman respected in her community. There are records of women who brewed for 20, 30, even 40 years, building genuine businesses that supported their families. One woman, Denise Merrier, brewed for more than 20 years in the late 1400s. When her husband was alive, his butcher shop was the main income. But her brewing, that was insurance, that was backup, that was power. Now, I need you to understand something about the timeline here. All of this work, everything I just described, bed, had to happen in about 6 weeks, maybe 8 if you were lucky with the weather. harvesting grain while it was ripe, slaughtering animals on Martinmas, processing meat, drying vegetables, brewing ale, making preserves, checking storage areas, repairing storage containers, and oh, by the way, you still had to cook daily meals, care for children, tend any animals you were keeping alive, mend clothes, and do 100 other tasks that did not stop just because it was harvest season. The physical exhaustion must have been unimaginable. Women would go to bed after working for 16 hours and wake up before dawn to do it again. Hands blistered and bleeding from cutting grain, back screaming from bending over to harvest, feet aching from standing to stir massive pots of preserves. And through it all, a constant mental calculation. Do we have enough?
Did I dry the beans long enough? Is that meat salty properly? Will the apples last? Because if you miscalculated, if you made a mistake, if you ran out of food in February when there was still 2 months until the growing season began again, there was no grocery store to bail you out.
There was only hunger and possibly death. I've got a real example that brings this home. Historians found records from a manor in England detailing exactly what needed to be paid as rent at Michaelmas, the end of September. One woman owed 2 hens and 12 eggs. Another owed a bushel of grain and a measure of honey.
These were not small amounts. This was food she desperately needed for her own family's survival.
But it had to be paid or she could lose her home, her land, everything.
So women were not just preparing for their own families. They were also preparing enough to pay rent, tithes to the church, and sometimes to sell at market to get little money for things they could not make themselves, like salt, like iron tools, like medicine.
The pressure was enormous, relentless, and it fell most heavily on women because society expected them to make it all work somehow. Men might do the heavy ploughing and building, but women managed everything else. The planning, the processing, the preserving, the organizing, all of it. And you know what the most remarkable thing is? Most of them succeeded.
Most families made it through winter. Not easily, not comfortably, but they survived because women were absolutely brilliant at
resource management. They had to be. Let me share one more detail that just amazes me. Women also had to gather and preserve herbs and plants for medicine. There were no pharmacies, no doctors for common folk. If someone got sick in January, you treated them with herbs you had dried back in summer. So women needed to know which plants to gather, when to gather them for maximum potency, how to dry them, how to store them, and how to use them. This was life and death knowledge. A mother who knew her herbs could save her child from a fever. One who did not might watch that child die. Everything, and I mean everything, depended on those frantic weeks in autumn. Miss a day because of bad weather. You might not get the harvest in before it rotted, forget to gather enough firewood. You might freeze, fail to preserve meat properly. You might starve. Each task was connected to a dozen others. Each mistake would cascade into disaster. But here's what I want you to really understand. These women did not just passively accept this burden, they mastered it. They developed techniques, passed down knowledge, innovated solutions. They created systems that worked. And they did it while society told. They were worth less than men, while laws restricted their rights, while they were expected to be subservient and grateful. That, my friends, is the definition of strength. So the next time you are stressed about meal planning for the week or frustrated that you have to go to the grocery store, think about these women. Think about what they manage with a fraction of the resources, none of the technology, and all of the pressure. It puts our modern complaints in perspective, does it not? Those 6 weeks in autumn were a race against time, against weather, against nature itself. And the women who ran that race, they were marathoners, they were champions, they were survivors. But even the best preparation could not protect against everything winter had in store. Because once that cold truly set in, once the snow began to fall and the days shrank to just a few hours of weak sunlight, women faced challenges that make harvest season look easy by comparison. And the most dangerous challenge of all, childbirth in the dead of winter. When a woman went into labor as snow piled up outside, when the midwife had to brave freezing temperatures to reach her, when complications arose with no doctor for miles, that is when winter showed its cruelest face. That is where we're going next, to the birthing room. To understand why bringing life into the world during winter was an act of courage that deserves to be remembered forever. There is a moment that every medieval woman knew was coming. A moment she had witnessed in other women's homes, a moment she had heard about in whispered conversations, a moment she both longed for and feared with equal intensity. The moment when labor began. And if that moment came in the depths of winter, when the world outside was frozen and dark, that fear multiplied tenfold. Let me tell you something that might shock you. More than 1 in 3 women died during their childbearing years in medieval Europe. Not from accidents, not from disease, from pregnancy and childbirth. 1 in 3. Stop and think about that for a second. If you had 3 female friends, statistically one of them would not survive having children. And in winter, those odds got even worse. I want to take you into a birthing room on a cold January night in the year 1420. Are you ready? Because this is not going to be easy, but it is important. These women's stories deserve to be told. It is 2 o'clock in the morning. Snow is falling heavily outside, piling up against the walls of a small timber house in rural England. Inside, a woman named Margaret is in labor with her 4th child. She is 28 years old. She has already lost 1 baby in infancy, but her other 2 children are healthy. Tonight, she is terrified. Not just of the pain, though that is considerable. She is terrified because her last birth went badly. Hemorrhaging fever. She nearly died, and now she has to do it again in the coldest month of the year. But Margaret is not alone. And that is the first thing you need to understand about medieval childbirth. It was a women's mystery, a sacred circle that men were absolutely forbidden from entering. Around Margaret are 5 other women. Her mother, who has attended more births than she can count, her sister, who just had a baby herself 6 months ago. 2 neighbors who have known Margaret since childhood, and the midwife, a woman named Agnes, who's been delivering babies in this village for 30 years. Agnes is respected, feared a little bit, and absolutely essential. Without her, many more women and babies would die. Now here is something fascinating. In 1469, there is a recorded case in Belgium where a man was fined 15 livres for hiding behind a staircase to eavesdrop on his wife's labor. 15 livres. That was serious money. Because childbirth was not just private. It was sacred women's territory. Men could bring food to the door. They could pray outside. But inside that room... Why? Well, partly modesty and propriety. Medieval society was obsessed with keeping female bodies hidden from male eyes. But there was more to it than that. These women had knowledge, real, practical, life-saving knowledge that they had passed down from mother to daughter for generations. They knew positions that could ease labor, herbs that could speed it or slow it, techniques to stop hemorrhaging, ways to turn a baby that was positioned wrong. This was their expertise, their power, and they guarded it fiercely. Let me tell you about birthing girdles. Queen Elizabeth of York, wife of King Henry VII, paid 6 shillings and 8 pence in the winter of 1502 for something called Our Lady Girdle. This was supposedly a girdle, like a belt or sash, that the Virgin Mary herself had worn when giving birth to Jesus. Now, did
Mary actually wears it?
Of course not. But Elizabeth believed it might help.
She was about to give birth in February, and she was taking every precaution she could.
These birthing girdles were covered in prayers, images of saints, religious symbols.
Women would wrap them around their bellies during labor, hoping for divine protection. And you know what? Elizabeth was not unusual. Women across Europe, from queens to peasants, used these amulets.
Some were passed down in families. Some were borrowed from monasteries. Some were made specially by the woman herself.
Were they medically effective? Number.
Did they provide comfort, hope, and a sense of control in a situation that was inherently uncontrollable? Absolutely. And sometimes that psychological comfort might have actually helped by keeping the woman calmer, more focused, less panicked. But let us get back to Margaret. It is now 4 o'clock in the morning, and her labor is progressing. Agnes has examined her and says the baby is positioned well. This is good news. A breech birth where the baby comes feet first was incredibly dangerous, often fatal, with no ability to perform a safe cesarean section. A breech baby might mean death for both mother and baby.
Her and child.
The room is warm. Too warm, actually. The women have built up the fire until the room is almost stifling because cold was believed to be dangerous during birth. Medieval medical theory based on the ancient Greek idea of 4 humors taught that women were naturally cold and wet. Childbirth made them even more vulnerable to cold. So the room had to be hot. Windows were shuttered tight, doors were sealed. Sometimes they even hung extra blankets to keep out drafts. Now, modern medicine tells us this was probably not ideal. Poor ventilation, too much heat that could cause problems. But the women did not know that. They were doing their absolute best with the knowledge they had, and in many ways that knowledge was sophisticated. Agnes knows, for instance, that Margaret needs to stay hydrated. She is giving her small sips of ale mixed with honey and herbs. She knows that Margaret should not lie flat on her back, that upright positions can help labor progress. So Margaret is kneeling, supported by her sister and mother, one on each side. Agnes is in front, coaching her through each contraction, telling her when to push and when to rest. The other women are not just standing around. One is preparing clean linens to wrap the baby. Another is keeping the fire going and heating water. Another is crushing herbs for a poultice in case there is tearing. Everyone has a job.
Everyone contributes. This is community support in its most fundamental form.
Now let me tell you what is not happening. There is no pain relief. None. No epidural, no pain medication of any kind. Some midwives used herbs like birthwort or mugwort which they believed eased pain, but the effectiveness was questionable at best. Most women just had to endure for hours, sometimes days. The pain was considered inevitable, part of Eve's curse from the Garden of Eden. Women were supposed to suffer in childbirth because Eve had eaten the forbidden fruit. That is what the Bible taught. That is what the church preached. Can you imagine going into labor knowing that society believed your pain was divine punishment, that you deserved to suffer, and still finding the courage to go through with it? That is a level of bravery I cannot even comprehend. It is now 6 a.m. Margaret has been in active labor for 4 hours. Outside, the sky is just beginning to lighten, though with the heavy snow it is harsh, indeed to tell. And then finally the baby comes, a girl. She is small but breathing. Agnes quickly clears the baby's mouth and nose, wraps her in warm linen, and hands her to Margaret's mother, while she attends to Margaret. This is a critical moment. The minutes right after birth are when hemorrhaging is most likely. Agnes massages Margaret's belly to help expel the placenta and encourage the uterus to contract. She watches carefully for excessive bleeding, and she prays because for all her skill and experience, Agnes knows that sometimes, despite everything, women die, and there is nothing she can do about it. Margaret is lucky. The placenta comes out intact. The bleeding is normal. She is exhausted in pain but alive. The baby is nursing. The other women are cleaning up, changing the soiled linens, bringing Margaret something to eat. In a few hours, Margaret's husband will be allowed to come in and meet his new daughter. But for now, this is still women's space, sacred space. But not every story ended this way, not even close. In medieval miracle stories, collections of tales about saints performing miracles, researchers found that about 3.3% of all miracles involved saving women or babies during childbirth. That does not sound like much until you realize what it means. If childbirth was safe and routine, why would people be desperately praying for miracles? They prayed because they knew the danger. They prayed because they had watched mothers, sisters, daughters die. They prayed because they had no other option. Some women died from hemorrhaging that could not be stopped, some from infections that spread through their bodies in the days after birth, some from obstructed labor that went on for so long they simply could not survive. And the babies, many babies did not make it either. Born too early, born not breathing, born with complications that medieval medicine could not fix. And here is the thing about winter birth specifically. Everything was harder. The midwife might have to walk through knee-deep snow to reach the laboring woman. If she lived several villages away, she might not make it at all. The cold meant that any drafts in the birthing room were more dangerous. Wet clothes or linens could not be dried quickly, increasing infection risk. If the mother or baby needed special care in the days after birth, traveling to get help was nearly impossible. Remember what we talked about with food preservation. By January or February, families were running low on supplies. A woman who had just given birth needed extra nutrition to recover and to produce milk for the baby. But what if there was not enough food? What if the stored vegetables had run out and all that was left was hard bread and salted meat? How does a new mother's body recover under those conditions? Let me share something that really drives this home. We have records showing that aristocratic women who had plenty of food, warm houses, and access to the best midwives money could buy, still faced significant risks in childbirth if they struggled. What about peasant women? Women who were malnourished, overworked, living in drafty houses, unable to rest properly after birth because there was too much work to do. Yet, despite everything, most women survived. Most babies survived. These midwives, with their passed-down knowledge and their skilled hands and their determined spirits, saved countless lives. Without any of our modern medical technology, without any pain relief, without antibiotics or blood transfusions or surgical options. They did it with knowledge, for example, experience, sheer willpower. And let me tell you about the women who did not survive because their stories matter too. When a woman died in childbirth, her family was devastated in ways we can barely imagine. Her children lost their mother. Her husband lost his wife. But practically speaking, who would now do all the work she had done? Who would spin the thread, preserve the food, care for the children, manage the household? Often the husband would remarry quickly, not because he did not love his first wife or did not grieve, but because survival required it. Children needed a mother. Households needed a woman's labor. It was pragmatic and tragic in the reality of medieval life. Some women, knowing the risks, would write their wills before giving birth. Can you imagine that? Being pregnant and writing your will just in case. Putting your affairs in order. Saying goodbye to your older children.
preparing for the possibility that you might not wake up after this baby comes. The courage that took. The absolute terror they must have felt.
But they did it anyway. Year after year, birth after birth. Because what choice did they have? This was their role, their expectation, their duty.
Most of them somehow found the strength to face it.
You know what gets me? We have all these romantic notions about the past, about simpler times, about natural childbirth being beautiful and empowering. And yes, there are beautiful aspects, the community of women, the sacred knowledge, the triumph when everything goes right. But let us not forget the fear, the pain, the very real danger. These women were warriors. They went into battle every time they got pregnant, and they did it knowing that they might not survive. That is why the community of women around childbirth was so important. It was not just practical support. It was emotional support. It was bearing witness. It was saying, you are not alone in this. We are here. We have done this. We will help you through. And if the worst happens, we will care for your children. We will remember you. This sacred circle of women gathering around a laboring mother in the dead of winter, keeping her warm, keeping her calm, bringing new life into a frozen world. This is one of the most profound examples of female strength and solidarity in all of history. But childbirth was not the only work women did during those long winter months. Here was another job, one that consumed hours every single day, one that kept the household clothed and even provided income, a job so associated with women that unmarried women are still called by its name even today, spinning. And the story of winter spinning is a story of endless invisible labor that literally built the medieval economy. That is where we are headed next. Listen to this sound, the gentle whir of a spinning wheel, the rhythmic whoosh of wool being drawn out into thread. For us today, it might seem peaceful, meditative even, but for a medieval woman sitting in a freezing room in the middle of January, spinning 12 hours a day with fingers so cold they can barely feel the wool, that sound was something else entirely. It was the sound of survival, the sound of money, the sound of endless invisible labor that the world depended on but barely acknowledged. Here is a fact that is going to blow your mind. To make just 1 square yard of cloth, you needed 1,800 yards of thread. 1 square yard. That is just enough fabric for a small tablecloth, or maybe a child's tunic. 1,800 yards of thread. Every single inch of that thread had to be spun by hand by women. Now, think about clothing. Think about bedding.
Think about bags, sails, tapestries, banners. Think about every piece of fabric in an entire medieval household. Someone had to spin all of that. And 99% of the time that someone was a woman.
Let me paint you a scene. It is early December, maybe around 4 in the afternoon.
The sun is already set. A woman named Eleanor sits near the small window of her cottage trying to catch the last bit of dying light. In her left hand, she holds a distaff, a long stick wrapped with prepared wool. In her right hand, she holds a spindle, a small weighted stick that dangles and spins as she draws out the fibers. Her fingers move with practiced precision, almost without thought. Draft, twist, wind, draft, twist, wind, over and over and over and over. She has been doing this since dawn, about 11 hours now. Her back aches from sitting in the same position. Her fingers are raw, the wool oils mixing with tiny cuts and calluses. Her eyes hurt from straining to see in the dim light, but she cannot stop. Not yet. She has a quota to meet. The local weaver has commissioned 20 skeins of thread by the end of the week, and she is behind. She needs the money, desperately.
Winter is expensive. Eleanor is not unruly.
Is the norm. Across Europe, millions of women spent their winter days exactly like this, spinning, always spinning. It was so ubiquitous, so fundamentally associated with women that we still use the word today, spinster. An unmarried woman because unmarried women often supported themselves through spinning. It was one of the few acceptable ways a woman could earn money independently. But let us talk numbers, because I want you to understand the sheer scale of this work. Historians have calculated that, to produce enough thread for one person working at a loom to weave continuously, you needed about 6 people spinning. 6 to 1. That is how much more labor-intensive spinning was compared to weaving. And guess what? The spinning was almost always done by women, while the weaving that was increasingly dominated by men, especially in professional guilds. So women did 6 times the work, but men got to join guilds, set prices, and control the market.
Does that seem fair to you? It did not seem fair to them either, but that was the reality they lived with.
Now you might be thinking, okay, spinning took time, but it was simple work, right? Nobody could do it. Wrong. Good spinning was an art, a skill that took years to master. The thread had to be even, no thick spots or thin spots. It had to have the right amount of twist, not too tight or it would snap, not too loose or it would fall apart. Different types of yarn required different techniques. Fine thread for weaving delicate fabrics, thick thread for heavy wool cloth, specialty threads for embroidery. And in winter, everything was harder. The cold made wool brittle and difficult to work with. You needed to warm it slightly, sometimes holding it close to your body or near the fire, but not too close, or the lanolin would melt out and make it greasy. Your fingers had to stay somewhat warm and flexible, but most medieval houses were freezing. So you spun with hands that were half numb, trying to maintain the same precision you had in summer when everything was easier. Let me tell you about a document that survives from medieval times. A poem called Piers Plowman that we mentioned earlier. In it, the author describes women who are so poor they have to spin constantly just to afford food. He writes about women who spend every penny they make from spinning on. Housing and milk and meal for porridge. Women who wake up at night not just to care for babies but to continue spinning because there are simply not enough hours in the day. This was not exaggeration. This was reality for countless women. Spinning was not a hobby. It was not arts and crafts. It was grinding, exhausting, never-ending labor that kept them and their families alive. And here is where it gets even more interesting. Women were paid less for spinning than men were paid for weaving, even though spinning required more labor and more skill. Why?
Well, historians have debated this. Some argue it was pure patriarchal prejudice. Women's work was simply valued less because women did it.
Others point out that women could spin at home while also watching children, cooking, cleaning, doing all their other tasks. So employers could argue that spinning was supplemental income, not primary work, even though for many women it absolutely was primary income. But there is another factor. Women were not allowed to form guilds for spinning in most places. Guilds were powerful organizations that controlled prices, quality standards, and who could practice a trade.
Without guilds, women had
collective bargaining power. They had to accept whatever price was offered. If they refused, well, there were always other desperate women willing to take the work. Yet, despite all this, some women thrived. Let me tell you about the silk women of London in the 15th century. These were women who specialized in silk throwing, which means twisting raw silk into usable thread and then weaving it into ribbons, calls for hair, decorative cords, buttons, tassels, fringes. This was skilled work, highly valued work. And these women were so successful, so economically powerful, that in 1455 they petitioned Parliament. They asked for protection against foreign competition. Think about that. Women in 1455, when women had virtually no political rights, organized themselves and petitioned Parliament. They did not have a guild. They could not vote.
They could not hold office. But they had economic power, and they used it. That is remarkable. But for most women, spinning was not glamorous or lucrative. It was just necessary. Let me give you a sense of what a typical winter day looked like for a woman who spun for income. She wakes before dawn. The house is freezing. She wraps herself in extra years. Her heaviest wool dress may be a shawl. She revives the fire from the embers carefully because firewood is precious. She makes a simple breakfast, probably bread and ale for her family. Then she sits down to spin. She will spin for 3 or 4 hours. Then she will stop to prepare a midday meal. More bread, maybe some pottage if they have vegetables left. She eats quickly, barely tasting the food, then back to spinning. Another 4 or 5 hours. By now her shoulders are screaming. Her fingers are cramping, but she keeps going because she needs to finish this batch.
Evening comes. Time to make supper, time to mend clothes, time to check on the children. Time to do the 100 small tasks that never end. And then if she's behind on her spinning quota, she will spin for another 2 or 3 hours by firelight or candlelight. Do you know how hard it is to spin by firelight? The flickering makes it difficult to see what you are doing, but she does it anyway because she has to. She finally goes to bed around 10 or 11 at night. She has spun for maybe 12 or 14 hours today, and she will do the exact same thing again the next day and the day after that, and the day after that, hat all winter long. Now imagine doing this while pregnant, while nursing a baby, while recovering from childbirth, while sick with a winter cold. Women did all of it. They had no choice. But here is what I want you to understand. This was not just busy work. This was the foundation of the medieval economy. Textiles were one of the most valuable trade goods in Europe. Whole regions built their wealth on cloth production. Cities grew up around the textile trade. And all of it, every single bit of it, depended on women sitting in cold rooms spinning thread. Without women spinning, there would be no cloth. Without cloth, there would be no clothing industry, no trade networks, no economic growth. The invisible labor of women literally built medieval prosperity. And yet, how often do history books talk about spinning? How often do we learn about these women in school? Almost never. Because it was women's work, and women's work has always been invisible. Here is another thing that gets me. The tools women used for spinning were simple: a distaff and a spindle. That is it. The spindle was just a stick with a weight on it called a whorl. The distaff was just a longer stick to hold the prep.
Arid fibers.
These were not expensive tools, they were not complicated to make, but they were powerful. With just these two sticks, a skilled woman could produce thread fine enough for the most delicate fabrics or thick enough for heavy cloaks. And these tools became symbols. In medieval art, women are almost always shown with a distaff and spindle. It was how artists indicated that a person was female. Even the Virgin Mary is often depicted spinning. The distaff became such a symbol of women's work that the phrase distaff side came to mean the maternal side of a family. Even today, some people still use that expression without knowing where it came from. The spinning wheel did not arrive in Europe until the 13th century, and it did not become common until much later. For most of the medieval period, it was all done with hand spindles. Do you know how slow that is? I have tried it. I can maybe spin 15 or 20 yards of rough yarn in an hour, and that is with modern, perfectly prepared fiber. Medieval women could produce much more because they had lifelong practice. But even so, 1,800 yards for 1 square yard of cloth, that is months of work. Months.
And let me tell you what happened in winter specifically. The cold weather was actually seen as good for some types of spinning wool. The dry, cold air meant less humidity, which helped keep the fibers from getting too slippery or sticky. So, winter was actually peak spinning season. Women who might do other work in spring and summer, field work or gardening, would focus almost entirely on spinning in winter. Some women became specialists known for producing exceptionally fine thread or particularly strong thread or thread with specific qualities. These women could command higher prices. They had reputations. They had status within their communities, even if they had no formal recognition in the wider world. But most women just spun ordinary thread for ordinary cloth, and they did it day after day, year after year, decade after decade. Their fingers wore grooves into the wood of their spindles, their shoulders permanently rounded from the posture. Their eyesight failed young from straining to see fine fibers. This was the cost of keeping the medieval world clothed. I want to share something that really drives this home. There is a medieval manuscript illustration that shows the Virgin Mary spinning while the angel Gabriel announces that she will give birth to Jesus. Mary is spinning. Even in this most sacred, miraculous moment, the artist could not imagine a woman without her work. She is holy. She's blessed. She is about to become the Mother of God. And she is spinning because that is what women did always without exception. Now, let us talk about what
happened to this thread once women finished spinning it, because that is another whole world of women's work. The thread had to be woven into cloth. Now, as I mentioned, weaving became increasingly male-dominated in professional settings. But in households, women wove too. They had smaller looms for making simple cloth for family use. And they did not just weave. They also dyed fabric using plants and minerals and sometimes insects to create colors. They filled cloth, a process of beating and washing it to make it thicker and warmer. They raised the nap on wool to make it soft. They cut and sewed clothing. The entire textile process, from sheep to shirt, was primarily women's work. Yes, men got involved in some steps, especially in professional commercial production. But in households, which is where most people got their clothes, women did everything. And in winter, when outdoor work was impossible, textile production filled every spare moment. Some women, particularly widows or unmarried women, turned this into serious businesses. Records show women who employed other women, who supplied professional weavers with thread, who sold finished cloth at markets. These women had economic
real power. But they operated in a system designed to limit that power at every turn. And yet they persisted. They found ways to succeed. They built networks with other women. They passed skills to their daughters. They created value in a world that told them they had no value.
That is revolutionary.
That is resistance. And it happened every single day in every single village and town across Europe.
So the next time you put on a sweater or wrap yourself in a blanket or wear literally any piece of cloth, think about the women who made that possible. Think about the thousands of years of women's hands transforming raw fibers into thread, thread into cloth, cloth into the things that keep us warm and comfortable. That tradition stretches back to the beginning of human civilization, and medieval women were carrying it forward under some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Their work was invisible, but it was essential. Their labor was undervalued, but it was irreplaceable. They spun through cold and pain and exhaustion because their families needed them to, because the world needed them to, even if the world would never properly acknowledge it. But spinning and textile work has. Penned inside, protected from the elements at least somewhat. There was another aspect of winter survival that could not happen inside. could not be avoided no matter how cold it got. Because even in the depths of winter, even when snow piled up to the windows, people had to stay warm. And staying warm meant keeping the fire burning, which meant someone had to manage that fire, feed it, tend it, and make sure it never went out. Because if the fire died, so might the family. That is where we turn next to the heart of the medieval home, the eternal flame, the source of light and warmth and life itself. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night and being able to see your breath inside your own house, not outside, inside, in your bedroom.
In the room where your children are sleeping.
That was normal. That was just winter in medieval Europe. And the only thing standing between your family and freezing to death was a pile of burning wood in the center of your home.
That fire was not a luxury. It was not decoration. It was survival itself.
And keeping it alive, that was primarily Wynn's work.
Let me take you inside a typical medieval peasant house on a January night.
Forget everything.
You know about modern homes. Forget insulation. Forget central heat. Forget double-pane windows. This house is small, maybe 20 feet by 15 feet. The walls are made of timber frame filled with wattle and daub, basically woven sticks covered in mud and straw. The roof is thatched, layers of straw piled thick.
There is no chimney. The smoke from the fire just rises up and eventually finds its way out through a hole in the roof or gaps in the thatch.
There are no glass windows. Maybe there are a few small openings with wooden shutters that can be closed against the wind. But closing the shutters means darkness, so you have to choose light and freezing cold wind or darkness, and slightly less freezing cold. The floor is packed dirt, maybe with some rushes or straw scattered on it for insulation. And in the center of this one-room house, on a raised platform of packed clay and stone, burns the hearth fire. This fire never goes out, not if you can help it. Because starting a new fire in winter is difficult, time-consuming, and uses up precious resources. So you keep it burning day and night, week after week, month after month, from the first cold day in autumn until the warm day.
His return in spring. And who maintains this fire? Who makes sure it never dies? Women. Almost always women. Let me introduce you to someone. Her name is Beatrice. She is 35 years old, mother of 4, wife to a farmer named Thomas. It is 3 o'clock in the morning on a night in late January. The temperature outside is well below freezing.
Inside, maybe just above freezing, maybe. Beatrice wakes up, not from an alarm clock, obviously, but from internal instinct. She has been doing this long enough that her body knows.
Time to check the fire. She wraps her woolen cloak tighter around herself, the same cloak she's been sleeping in because taking it off would be too cold, and she walks the few steps to the hearth.
The fire is low, dangerously low, just red embers glowing in the darkness. If she does nothing, it will be out by morning, and starting a new fire means striking flint and steel, catching a spark in dry tinder, carefully building it up.
In the cold, with numb fingers, this could take half an hour or more. Half an hour they do not have, half an hour they cannot afford.
So, Beatrice adds wood carefully. Not too much or it will smother the embers.
Not too little or it will not.
Catch.
She has done this thousands of times. She knows exactly how much wood to add. She blows gently on the embers, coaxing them back to life.
The wood catches, flames rise, the room immediately begins to feel slightly less frigid. She will do this again in 3 hours and 3 hours after that. All night, every night, all winter long. You know what is fascinating? Archaeological excavations of medieval houses show these central hearths with layers of ash several feet deep. The ash built up over years, decades even, because families rarely cleaned it all out. Why? Because the ash provided insulation. It held heat. It was a thermal mass that helped keep the fire going and radiated warmth even when the flames were low. These families understood something about heat retention that we have forgotten in our world of thermostats and forced air heating. But let us talk about what this fire meant beyond just heat. This was the cooking fire. Every meal Beatrice prepared for her family cooked over these flames. She would hang a cauldron from an iron hook above the fire, and in that cauldron she would make pottage, that thick vegetable and grain stew that was the backbone of medieval diet. It would simmer all day and she would add ingredients as she had them. A piece of salted meat, some dried peas, a handful of grain, whatever was available. The fire was also the light source. When the sun set at 4 in the afternoon and darkness fell, this fire was all you had. Yes, wealthy people had candles, beeswax candles if they were really wealthy. Tallow candles made from animal fat if they were less so. But candles were expensive. You did not burn them casually. So for most people, firelight was their evening light. Can you imagine trying to do anything by firelight? It is dim, it flickers, it creates moving shadows that make it hard to see clearly. But women spun thread by firelight. They mended clothes. They cared for children.
They did all the evening tasks that needed doing, straining their eyes in the uncertain glow.
And here is the thing about smoke. Because there is no chimney, remember?
The smoke fills the house.
It hangs in the air. It makes your eyes water, makes you cough. Medieval people lived their entire lives breathing in wood smoke.
Researchers today who study medieval skeletons can see the effects: respiratory problems, lung damage.
This was the cost of saying,
Eyeing warm.
But people developed strategies. They built houses with high roofs so the smoke would rise up and away from where people lived and slept. They used certain types of wood that produced less smoke. Dry wood, well seasoned, burns cleaner than green wood. So, gathering and storing firewood was not just about quantity, it was about quality. Let me tell you about firewood management, because this was a huge part of women's winter work. A typical family needed several cords of wood to make it through winter. A cord of wood is a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. That is a lot of wood, and it all had to be gathered before winter began. In some places, peasants had the right to gather dead wood from the Lord's forest. Dead wood only. If you cut down living trees without permission, that was theft. Serious theft. You could be fined or worse.
So women and children would walk through the forest looking for fallen branches, dead trees, anything that could legally be taken.
Then it had to be transported home, cut into manageable pieces, stacked to dry, protected from rain and snow,
and stored somewhere close to the house, but not so close that it was afire.
Zod.
All of this took planning, organization, labor. And then throughout the winter, someone had to bring the wood in, feed the fire, manage the burn rate, make sure you were not using wood too fast, because running out meant death. Make sure the fire stayed hot enough to cook, but not so hot it was wasteful.
This was complex resource management, and women were the managers.
Now, let me tell you about an innovation that some medieval homes had.
Wealthier households, not rich exactly, but families with a bit more resources, would sometimes build a wooden parlor inside their stone or timber house. Literally, a house within a house, a smaller wooden structure inside the main building, heavily insulated with cloth hangings and extra walls. The family would retreat into this inner room during the coldest months, essentially abandoning the rest of the house to the cold.
Why does this work?
Because it is much easier to heat a small space than a large one. That central fire could keep a 10 by 10 foot room reasonably warm. A 20 by 15 foot room, much harder. So they created a winter room, a survival pod, and they lived there from December through February, venturing out only when
Necessary.
Women would hang tapestries or heavy cloth on the walls of this inner room, creating an additional layer of insulation. They would cover the floor with extra rushes or straw. They would seal every crack and gap they could find, and they would keep the fire burning hot in this small space. But most families could not afford this. Most families lived in their one room and made do, which meant finding other ways to stay warm. Body heat. Never underestimate body heat. People slept together. Entire families in one bed or beds pushed close together. Children piled in with their parents. Sometimes even animals were brought inside.
Not pet animals necessarily.
Livestock, cows, goats, chickens. They would be kept in one section of the house, separated from the human area by a partial wall, and their body heat would help warm the space. This was not unusual. This was standard practice in colder regions. Archaeological evidence shows many medieval houses with areas clearly designed for animals. And you know what? Those animals survived winter better when they were inside, too. It was mutually beneficial. Clothing was another strategy. People dressed in layers, lots of layers. A lie. Nen undergarment directly against the skin, then a woolen tunic or dress, then another woolen layer, then maybe a thick cloak. And they kept these layers on all day, all night. You did not undress for bed in winter. You just lay down in what you were wearing, and maybe added an extra blanket. Blankets were precious, heavy woolen blankets that had taken weeks or months to make. Families would pile all their blankets on the bed, sometimes sleeping under 3 or 4 layers. And still, they were cold. People woke up with frost on the inside of their blankets. That was reality. Let me share a detail that really brings this home. In wealthier households, there is evidence of people using bed warmers. These were metal pans with long handles. You would fill them with hot coals from the fire, then run them between the sheets of your bed just before getting in. This would warm the bed slightly, taking the edge off the killing cold. But you had to be careful because hot coals in bed could obviously start a fire. So this was not a casual thing. This was a calculated risk that people took because they were that desperate for warmth.
And here is something that might surprise you.
People in Iceland, and during the medieval period, had a different strategy. They built their houses near geothermal hot springs. They had indoor hot baths.
Can you imagine?
While most of Europe was freezing, some Icelanders were soaking in naturally heated water inside their homes. The men would spend hours in these baths, and women would bring them food and anything they needed so they never had to get out. Visitors would join them in the bath.
It was the center of winter social life.
Now, that is one solution I think we can all appreciate. But it only worked if you happened to live on top of volcanic hot springs. For everyone else, it was fires and layers and shared body heat. There were also portable heating solutions, fire bowls made of metal or ceramic that could be moved from room to room. In larger houses with multiple rooms, you could not heat everywhere. So, you would have a portable fire source that you brought to wherever people were working or sleeping. Again, dangerous.
The risk of fire was always present, but the risk of freezing was more immediate. Churches had a different problem. These were large stone buildings with high ceilings, impossible to heat effectively.
So, people attending.
Mass in winter would bring their own hand warmers. These were hollow metal spheres with small holes for ventilation. You would put hot coals inside, close it up, and hold it in your hands. Enough heat to keep your fingers from going numb during a long service. Women made these hand warmers. Women filled them with coals.
Women managed all the small strategies that made winter survivable.
But even with all these techniques, winter was brutal. People got sick. The combination of cold, poor ventilation, smoke inhalation, and close quarters with many people meant illness spread quickly. A winter cold could turn into pneumonia. Pneumonia could kill you. There were no antibiotics, no real treatments beyond rest and whatever herbal remedies people knew. And women were the caregivers. When children got sick, women nursed them. When elderly parents grew weak, women cared for them. When husbands fell ill, women kept the household running and tried to heal them with herb teas and hot compresses and prayer. The mental and emotional toll must have been enormous. Imagine living for 4 months in near constant cold in smoke-filled rooms, with limited food, watching your children shiver. Wondery. If you have enough firewood to last, hoping everyone stays healthy because you know you cannot afford to lose anyone. And yet, people did it year after year, generation after generation. They survived winters that would kill most of us within days. They adapted, they innovated, they endured.
Here is something I find particularly poignant. There are records of elderly people who would voluntarily eat less in winter. They would give their food to the children and grandchildren, saying they were not hungry or had already eaten.
Why?
Because they understood that the young had a better chance of survival. That their own deaths, while sad, were less devastating to the family's future than losing a child. This was happening. Elderly women especially, because they were considered less valuable than men, even in old age, would sacrifice themselves quietly, without drama, just eating a little less each day until they were too weak to continue. That is the level of desperation that winter could bring. So when we talk about women surviving winter, we are not just talking about practical strategies. We are talking about sacrifice, about courage, about making impossible choices, and living with the consequences. But winter was not only cold and darkness. There were also moments of light, moments of celebration that broke up the long, hard months. Moments when communities came together and reminded themselves why survival mattered. And the biggest, brightest moment of all, Christmas. The 12 days when work stopped, when food was shared, when even the poorest families tried to find joy in the depths of winter. That festival, that brief respite, was a lifeline. And understanding what it meant to medieval people, especially medieval women. That is what we explore next. There was one date that every person in medieval Europe counted down to. Rich or poor, young or old, everyone looked forward to this moment with desperate hope. December 24th, Christmas Eve, because starting that night, for 12 full days, everything stopped. All work ceased. No one labored in the fields, obviously, because it was winter. But more than that, no one was supposed to do any work at all. No spinning, no cooking beyond what was necessary, no repairs, no obligations to the Lord. For 12 days, from Christmas Eve until Epiphany on January 6th, life paused. And for women especially, this was not just a holiday. This was survival.
Let me tell you what those 12 days meant to someone like our friend Beatrice, the woman we met tending her fire at 3 in the morning. For her, Christmas was the only time all winter when she could rest, truly rest.
Yes, she still had to feed her family, still had to keep the fire going, but the crushing pressure of quotas and obligations lifted. The spinning could wait, the mending could wait. The Lord would not demand extra labor. For 12 precious days she could breathe, but Christmas was so much more than rest. It was lighting the darkness, literally and figuratively.
Let me paint you a picture of Christmas Eve in a medieval village.
It is late afternoon, maybe around 4 o'clock, and the sun is already set.
The village is dark except for one building that glows like a beacon.
The church.
Every family that can manage it has brought candles.
And the church is ablaze with light. More light than you have seen in one place for months.
The effect is almost overwhelming. After living in dimness and shadow for so long, this many candles feels like a miracle.
Inside the church is packed, bodies pressed together, which actually helps with warmth.
The priest is conducting Mass, speaking in Latin that most people do not understand, but that does not matter. They know why they are here. They are here to mark the birth of Christ. They are here to pray for survival through the rest of winter. They are here because being together as a community reminds them they are not alone in their suffering. Women have brought their hand warmers, those metal spheres filled with hot coals we talked about earlier. They hold them during the long service, shifting from hand to hand to keep their fingers from going numb. Children are bundled in every piece of clothing their families own. The very poor stand in the back because pew space is limited and often claimed by wealthier families. But everyone is there. This is too important to miss. After Mass, people return to their homes, but the celebration continues. And here is where women's work becomes central again. Because Christmas dinner is not just any meal, this is the feast. The one time all winter when you are not carefully rationing every scrap. The one time when you try to have abundance, or at least the illusion of it. For weeks, women have been saving for this, a special cheese, maybe some dried fruit preserved in honey. Perhaps, if the family is lucky, fresh meat. Not the salted meat they've been eating since Martinmas, but something killed just for this occasion. A goose, maybe a pig.
Whatever the family can afford. And here is something beautiful. In many manners, the Lord would invite some of his peasants to feast in his hall on Christmas Day. Not all of them, of course. Sometimes it was the most loyal workers. Sometimes it was chosen by lot, which must have been agonizing. Imagine being a peasant woman, hoping your family gets selected because you know that feast in the Lord's hall means your children will eat well for at least one day. The Lord's feast meant meat, bread, ale, maybe even wine, food you never get to eat. There is a recorded tradition where one lucky peasant would be chosen to bring 2 friends, and the 3 of them could eat and drink as much as they wanted for the duration of 2 burning candles. 1 candle after another. So maybe 4 or 5 hours total. Can you imagine? After months of careful rationing, suddenly you could eat until you were full, until you were more than full, until your stomach hurt from the unaccustomed abundance. And what? Ever you could carry away in your clothes, you could keep. So people would stuff bread and cheese and pieces of meat into their tunics, into pockets, anywhere they could hide food. Taking home treasures for family members who had not been invited. This was not stealing. This was part of the tradition, expected, encouraged even. But not every peasant family got invited to the Lord's hall. Most did not, so they celebrated at home, making the best meal they could with what they had. And women made it special. Even if the ingredients were humble, women found ways to make Christmas dinner feel different. Maybe adding extra herbs, maybe shaping the bread differently, maybe using a precious bit of honey to sweeten a dish.
The house would be decorated not with expensive ornaments, those did not exist for common people, but with nature.
Holly branches with their bright red berries, ivy, bay leaves, anything green that could be found in the frozen landscape. A chronicle from 12th century London describes it perfectly, saying that every house and every parish church was decked with holly, ivy, bay, and whatsoever the season of the year afforded to be green. Women and children would go out and
Gather these greens, bringing life, color into the brown and grey world of winter, hanging them from the rafters, placing them around the doorway, transforming their small, dark, cold house into something festive, something special, and the decorations served another purpose. They were symbols. Holly, with its sharp leaves and red berries, represented the crown of thorns and blood of Christ. Ivy, which stays green all year, represented eternal life. These were not just pretty decorations. They were prayers made visible, hopes made tangible. Now, here is something that might surprise you. During Christmas, even the poorest families tried to have ale or wine. In fact, brewing extra ale for Christmas was something women started weeks in advance, because Christmas ale was not just for drinking, it was for sharing. Neighbors would visit each other, and you would offer them ale and whatever food you could spare. This was hospitality. This was community bonds being reinforced. And there were games and entertainments. Nothing elaborate for common folk, but children would play in the snow if there was snow. Adults would tell stories by the fire. There were songs, simple folk songs that everyone knew. Sometimes traveling performers would come to larger villages, bringing music and juggling and tales of the outside world. For 12 days, life had a different quality. The grinding desperation lifted just enough that people could remember what it felt like to be happy, to laugh, to enjoy life instead of just surviving it. But, and this is important, Christmas was not free. Peasants still owed obligations. Many had to pay extra rent to the Lord during Christmas, usually in the form of food, eggs, hens, bread. Even during this time of celebration, women had to make sure they had set aside enough to pay what was owed and still feed their own families. The pressure never completely went away. There were also religious obligations. You are expected to attend Mass multiple times during the 12 days. You were expected to fast on certain days, even during the Christmas season. Medieval Christianity was complicated with rules about when you could eat meat, when you had to abstain, when certain foods were allowed or forbidden. And women, as the household food managers, had to navigate all these rules while also trying to make the season special. Let me tell you about St. Stephen. NS Day, December 26th, the day after Christmas. This was the day when the village would often have communal activities. In some places there were processions. In others there were charity distributions where wealthier people would give food or clothing to the poor. Women would line up with their children hoping to receive something extra that would help them through the rest of winter. And there was the tradition of mumming or guising, where people would dress up in costumes often made from rags and scraps and go door to door performing little plays or songs in exchange for food or coins. This was not considered begging. This was entertainment, tradition, and it was a way for the poorest families to get a little extra to survive. Women would save scraps of fabric all year to make costumes for their children to go mumming, because even a few coins or a loaf of bread could make a difference. And it was one of the few times children could have fun, could play at being someone else, could feel special. Then there was Twelfth Night, January 5th, the night before Epiphany. This was the last night of the Christmas season, and many communities celebrated it with particular enthusiasm. Here were special cakes called 12th cakes. Inside one of these cakes, a woman would bake a dried bean or pea. Whoever got the slice with the bean became the king or queen of the feast for that night. Even a peasant child could become royalty for an evening. Can you imagine how magical that must have felt? Women baked these cakes, of course, using precious flour and whatever sweeteners they had, making something special to mark the end of the season. Because after 12th night, regular life resumed. Work began again. The brutal routine of winter survival returned. So this last celebration needed to be memorable.
But I want to talk about what Christmas meant psychologically because I think this is crucial to understanding how people survived winter. These 12 days were hope made real.
They were proof that winter would not last forever. They were a reminder that spring would come again. They broke up the long, dark months into before Christmas and after Christmas. Two separate struggles instead of one endless nightmare. For women especially who carried so much responsibility, who had so little control over their lives, who faced danger and exhaustion every single day, Christmas was a gift, a brief window where the rules relaxed, where abundance replaced scarcity, even if just for a moment, where joy was not only allowed but encouraged. And community gatherings meant women saw each other in contexts beyond work, beyond crisis. They could talk, laugh, share stories without it being about survival strategies. They could remember they were human beings, not just laborers. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, friends. They had value beyond what they produced. There is evidence that Christmas was also a time when women shared knowledge, recipes, remedies, techniques. An older woman might teach a younger one how to make a particular dish or how to prepare a certain herb. These informal teaching moments happening during the relaxed atmosphere of Christmas were how women's knowledge passed from generation to generation. And for young women, Christmas was often when matches were made.
Families would discuss potential marriages. Young people would see each other at church, at feasts, at gatherings.
Winter was actually a popular time for betrothals because families had time to negotiate, to discuss terms, to plan. And women, especially mothers, were heavily involved. In these negotiations. Who their daughters married mattered enormously. It could mean the difference between a hard life and an impossible one. But as wonderful as Christmas was, January 6th always came. Epiphany, the end of the season. On January 7th, everyone went back to work. Lords reasserted their demands. Spinning quotas resumed. The careful rationing of food became even more critical because you had just used up some of your winter stores on celebration. And here is the thing. The darkest, coldest part of winter was still ahead. Late January and February were often the worst months. The stored food was getting low. The cold was relentless. Illness was common, and spring, though you knew it was coming, was still months away. This is when people discovered what Christmas had really given them. Not just 12 days of rest and joy, but the strength to face what came next, the memories of laughter and light that could sustain them through the darkest days, the sense of community that meant they did not face hardship alone. Women drew on this. When they woke at 3 a.m. to tend the fire in late January, they remembered Christmas Eve Mass and all those candles. When hay spun thread until their fingers bled, they remembered 12th night and the surprise of finding the bean in the cake. When they faced impossible choices about feeding their children, they remembered that their community had gathered and celebrated and survived before, so they could survive again. But surviving the second half of winter meant managing even more complex challenges, because by February everything was running low. Food, firewood, patience, health, and women had to stretch what remained across the hardest weeks of the year. How they did that, the strategies they employed when there seemed to be nothing left to work with, that is a story of genius and desperation combined. That is where we go next to the late winter. The time when survival became an hour-by-hour battle, February. If you've made it to February, you've survived most of winter. But here is the cruel truth.
February might be the hardest month of all. The food stores you carefully rationed are running dangerously low.
The firewood pile that seemed adequate in November is shrinking faster than you hoped. Everyone is tired, bone-tired, the kind of tired that sleep does not fix. And the worst part, you still have weeks to go before the ground thaws enough to plant anything. Before fresh food becomes available, before you can truly believe you've survived. This is when women's double burden became absolutely crushing. Because here is something I need you to understand. Everything we have talked about so far, all the indoor work, the spinning, the cooking, the fire tending, the childcare, that was only half of what women did. The other half, they worked outside in the fields with the animals doing labor that we might think of as men's work, except it was everyone's work.
Survival required every pair of hands. Let me take you through a day in late February with a woman named Joanna. She is 26 years old.
She has 2 children, ages 4 and 7. Her husband, William, is a peasant farmer who works the Lord's land and also has a small plot for their family. It is 5 o'clock in the morning, still pitch dark, and Joanna is already awake. First, the fire.
She coaxes it back to life, adds wood, gets it burning steadily. Then she wakes her children, helps them dress in their layers of wool.
She makes a quick breakfast, probably bread that is getting stale because the grain s.
Tors are low, soaked in ale to soften it.
The children eat. She eats a smaller portion, telling herself she is not that hungry, but she is. She is always hungry by late February. By 6 o'clock, as the sky is just starting to lighten, Joanna is outside.
The cold hits her like a physical blow.
Her breath creates clouds. Her fingers immediately start going numb despite her mittens. But she has work to do. The animals need care.
Even though most livestock was slaughtered back in November, some animals were kept alive through winter. Dairy cows, breeding stock, chickens if the family's lucky. These animals have been living inside or in attached shelters. Remember, partly for their warmth, partly for ours, but they still need to be fed. They need water, which means breaking ice on the water trough. They need to be cleaned because months of indoor living means months of accumulated waste. This is not pleasant work. It is cold, it is dirty, it is physically demanding, and Joanna does it every single day. By 8 o'clock she comes back inside. The children need to be watched. The older one can help with small tasks, but the younger needs constant supervision. She sets them to simple work, maybe card, eyeing wool or sorting dried beans. And then Joanna sits down to her own work, spinning. Because even though it is late February, even though everyone is exhausted, the thread still needs to be made. Life does not stop for tiredness. She spins for 3 hours, her fingers moving automatically, her mind probably elsewhere, thinking about food, about whether they have enough to last. About whether this cough her younger child has is going to turn into something worse, about the fact that her husband needs a new tunic, but there is no fabric and no money to buy fabric. About 100 worries that never stop. At 11 o'clock, time to make a midday meal. What is there to cook? By late February, the variety is gone. It is pottage, but a much thinner pottage than in December. Maybe some turnips if they are still good. Some dried peas. That salted meat that has been boiled 3 times already to extract every bit of flavor and nutrition. She makes it work. She always makes it work. But she can see her children are still hungry after eating, and it breaks her heart. After the meal, William comes and tells her he needs help. There is fencing that needs repair before the growing season. Or perhaps the thatch on the barn needs attention, some job that requires extra hands. So Joanna wraps up warmer, leaves the children with a neighbor who's watching several children today, and goes out to work alongside her husband. This is where I need you to really pay attention, because this is the part of medieval women's lives that often gets erased from history. Women did physical labor, hard physical labor. They helped plow fields in the planting season. They harvested grain.
They carried water. They hauled firewood.
They repaired structures. They did whatever needed doing because survival required it.
Now, were there some jobs that men were more likely to do?
Yes.
Plowing with a heavy plow and oxen was usually men's work because it required significant upper body strength. Heavy blacksmithing was usually male. Certain skilled trades were male-dominated. But at the household level, among peasant families, the division was much less strict than you might think. A historical study of English peasant life found that women could perform almost any agricultural task.
Widows ran entire farms alone. Records show women plowing, women supervising fieldwork, women managing agricultural production.
Hey, we're completely capable. Society tried to say they were not. But the reality of survival said otherwise.
And here is something fascinating. During harvest time, when every hand was desperately needed, women and men were sometimes paid equally for the same work, the same piece rate. This almost never happened the rest of the year. But when it was critical to get the grain in before it spoiled, suddenly women's labor was worth the same as men's, which tells you everything about how value is assigned. Does it not? But let us get back to Joanna.
She works outside with William for 4 hours, lifting, hammering, holding. Her hands are torn and blistered. Her back aches. She is freezing cold and exhausted.
But at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when the light starts failing, she does not get to rest. She has to go back inside because there is dinner to prepare, children to feed, spinning to finish, clothes to mend, a fire to tend. William will come inside too, and he will be tired. He might help with some tasks, chopping more firewood perhaps, but the expectation is that Joanna will handle the indoor work. That is her domain, her responsibility. Never mind that she also worked outside for fowl.
Our house. Never mind that she is just as tired as he is. The house is her job. Can you imagine living like this? Can you imagine working outside in brutal cold, then coming home to more work? And no one thinks this is remarkable. This is just what women do, what they've always done. And this is not even accounting for pregnancy or nursing. Joanna could be doing all of this while pregnant or while nursing a baby, having to stop regularly to feed the infant, or while recovering from childbirth, which we talked about earlier. Women just kept working through all of it, because there was no alternative. Now I want to talk about something that historians have debated.
Why did society pretend that women only did domestic work when clearly they did so much more? Why did the image persist of women staying home while men worked when the reality was so different? Part of it was aspirational. Wealthy women did not do physical labor. They had servants for that. So the ability to keep your wife at home doing only household management became a status symbol, a sign that you had made it. Most peasant families could never achieve this, but they might have pretended to, at least in public discourse, because it made them feel more respectable. Part of it was legal and religious ideology. The Bible and church teaching said women should be subservient to men, that they were weaker, that their proper place was home. Never mind that reality contradicted this daily. The ideology was powerful enough to shape how people talked about work, even if it did not shape how work actually happened. And part of it was about inheritance and property rights. If you admitted that women did agricultural labor, that they were essential to farm production, then you might have to give them rights to that land, rights to inherit, rights to make decisions. Keeping women legally and socially subordinate required downplaying their actual contributions. But the women knew, and more importantly, they used that knowledge. A widow whose husband died could tell the Lord's steward, "Yes, I can manage this farm. I've been doing half the work all along," and often she could prove it. Records show widows successfully running agricultural operations, negotiating with lords, making business decisions. Because they had the skills and experience, they had just been doing it invisibly. Let me tell you about a medieval poem, the same Piers Plowman we have referenced before. There is a line that has always stuck with me. It describes poor women as those who spend their days in winter, waking up nights to rise on the bedside to rock the cradle, also to card and comb wool, to patch and to wash, to rub flax and reel yarn. Notice what is missing. Any mention of the outdoor work, the field work, the animal care, the heavy labor. Why? Because by the time this poem was written in the late 1300s, the ideology had taken hold. Even when describing the hardships of poor women's lives, the author could only see the indoor work. The outdoor work had become invisible, but it was happening. Every day in every season. Women working outside in snow and rain and freezing wind, and then coming inside to the work that was officially theirs. The cooking, the spinning, the child care, the fire tending, the double burden. Now, let me tell you about late winter field work specifically because this is important context. In February and early March, even though you could not plant yet, there was preparation work. Fields had to be cleared of debris, fences repaired, tools maintained, manure spread on fields to enrich the soil. This was cold, dirty work, and women participated in all of it. Spreading manure, for instance.
Think about that task, taking frozen lumps of animal waste and spreading them across frozen ground.
In medieval times, this was done by hand with wooden rakes and shovels. The smell, the cold, the sheer unpleasantness of it. But it had to be done if you wanted crops in the summer. Women did it alongside men, or consider water hauling.
Most peasant houses did not have wells right next to them. Water had to be carried from a well or stream, sometimes quite far away. In winter, this meant breaking ice, filling heavy wooden buckets, and carrying them back. This was usually ally women's work. Multiple trips per day, every day, their shoulders and backs developing permanent changes from years of carrying that weight, and firewood gathering. We talked about stockpiling wood before winter, but in a hard winter you might run out. So people would go out in February and March desperately looking for any wood they could legally take. Dead branches, fallen trees. Women would bundle this wood, tie it up, and carry it home on their backs. Older children would help, but the primary burden fell on women because men were often required to be working on the Lord's projects. Here is something that really drives home the unfairness. When peasants owed labor to their lord, which was a common obligation, it was usually the men who went to work the Lord's fields or do the Lord's projects. The women stayed home and did all the farm work for their own family, plus all the household work. So effectively, women were doing the work of two people, their own work and covering for their husband's labor that was going to the Lord. And they did not get extra recognition for this. Extra pay, extra food, nothing. It was just expected. Women would carry the full burden of maintaining their own household and farm while their husbands fulfilled feudal obligations. And then when the husband came home exhausted from a day of labor, he expected his wife to have dinner ready, to have the house managed, to have everything running smoothly. The mental load alone must have been crushing. Remembering everything that needed doing, planning meals with dwindling resources, deciding how to allocate firewood, calculating if the grain would last, making 100 small decisions every day, each one potentially meaning the difference between survival and disaster, and having no authority, no final say. Legally, her husband made the decisions.
Practically, she made them happen. Let me share one more detail that I find both heartbreaking and inspiring.
There are records of women forming informal work groups. In late winter, when everyone was struggling, women would help each other. Today you help me spread manure, and I will help you repair your fence. Today I watch your children, and you watch mine later. Today you lend me some grain, and I will pay you back at harvest. These networks were unofficial, unrecorded, but they were essential because the official systems, the ones run by men, did not account for women's needs, did not recognize women's work. So, women created their own systems, their own safety nets, and they survived because of them. This mutual aid was especially critical in late winter, when resources were lowest and needs were highest. A woman might share her last bit of salted meat with a neighbor whose child was sick, knowing that next month she might be the one who needs help. This was not charity. This was community survival, and it was primarily organized and maintained by women. So when we talk about women surviving winter, we are talking about them doing twice the work. Working outside in brutal conditions, then working inside under constant pressure, managing, calculating, planning, worrying, and somehow finding the strength to do it all over again the next day, for months, for years, for their entire lives. But even the strongest women had limits, and late winter pushed everyone to those limits. When food ran out before spring arrived, when illness struck weakened bodies, when the cold seemed like it would never end, that is when people needed more than just physical survival strategies. They needed mental and emotional survival tools, ways to cope with the darkness, both literal and metaphorical. And that is a whole other aspect of winter survival that we need to explore. The battle for hope itself, that is where we turn next. You know what? Nobody tells you about medieval winter. It is not just cold that wears you down. It is the darkness. Imagine this. You wake up in darkness. You work all morning by weak grey light filtering through your small window. And then at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, sometimes even earlier in deep winter, the sun sets, gone. And you have another 14 hours of darkness ahead of you. 14 hours, night after night after night for months. That kind of darkness does something to your mind, to your spirit. And for women who were already carrying impossible burdens, the psychological weight of endless winter nights was yet another battle to fight. Let me tell you what darkness meant in practical terms first, and then we will talk about what it meant emotionally, because both matter. When the sun set at 3 or 4 in the afternoon, you lost your primary light source. Yes, there was the fire. We have talked about that central hearth burning constantly, but firelight is dim, flickering, up, and reliable. Try threading a needle by firelight. Try spinning fine thread.
Try reading if you were one of the tiny percentage of people who could read. Everything becomes hard. Everything takes long.
And your eyes hurt from straining to see. Some families had candles, but candles were expensive. Beeswax candles were for the wealthy and the church. Most people, if they had candles at all, had tallow candles made from animal fat. And let me tell you about tallow candles. They smell terrible, like burning meat. They smoke, they drip, they do not burn evenly, but they provide light. So you tolerate the smell and the smoke because the alternative is pure darkness. Making tallow candles was women's work, naturally. You had to save animal fat throughout the year, render it down, which means heating it, and straining out impurities. Pour it into molds or dip wicks repeatedly until you built up layers of tallow. It was time-consuming. It was messy, and the resulting candles were mediocre at best, but they were light. And in winter, light was precious beyond measure. Most families could not afford to burn candles casually. You saved them for special occasions or genuine emergencies. So mawas. Tea winter evenings were spent by firelight alone, and that meant your productive work hours were severely limited. You could do some things by firelight. Women continued spinning, their fingers working by memory and feel as much as by sight. They could stir the pot of pottage. They could tend children. But detailed work, fine sewing, anything requiring precision, that had to wait for daylight, which meant that winter days were packed even fuller because you had so few useful hours. You had to accomplish everything during those brief hours of light. The pressure was enormous. And when darkness fell and you could no longer work effectively, you did not get to rest. You still had to tend the fire, still had to manage the household, still had to care for children who were restless and confined. But let us talk about what this darkness did psychologically, because this is where it gets really interesting and really hard. Seasonal depression is a real thing. We know now that lack of sunlight affects serotonin levels in the brain, that it can cause genuine clinical depression. Medieval people did not have the scientific knowledge to explain it, but they experienced it. And for women who were already dealing with malnutrition, exhaustion, constant stress, the addition of months of darkness could push them to breaking points. There are medieval medical texts that describe melancholy, a condition they associated with winter. Symptoms included sadness, lethargy, irritability, loss of appetite. Sound familiar? That is depression. They were describing depression, and their recommended treatments were things like exposure to light, pleasant company, music, good food, which is not terrible advice. The problem was that most people could not access those treatments. They could not just decide to have more light or better food. They were stuck with what they had. So how did women cope? How did they survive? Not just physically, but mentally. Through these dark months, community was essential. Remember those informal networks of women we talked about? They were not just for sharing labor. They were for sharing the emotional burden, too. Women would gather together when they could. Maybe at the well, when drawing water. Maybe when children were playing together. Maybe deliberately arranging to work on spinning or mending in the same room. And they would talk, not about anything professional. And necessarily, maybe just gossip, stories about neighbors, complaints about husbands or children, but that social connection, that reminder that you are not alone in your struggles, that was survival. Human beings are social creatures. We need connection. And women created opportunities for connection even when the darkness and cold made it difficult. Storytelling was another crucial tool. In the evenings when the family gathered around the fire, stories were told. Folk tales, local legends, stories about saints and miracles, stories about past winters and how the family survived them. This served multiple purposes. It entertained restless children. It passed on cultural knowledge. And it created a sense of continuity. Your grandmother survived winters like this. Your mother survived. You will survive too. Women were often the primary storytellers. They knew the family stories. They knew the folk tales. They knew which stories would soothe a frightened child or distract from hunger. Storytelling was another form of invisible labor, another way women held families together through the darkest times. Religion played a huge role in coping with darkness and hardship. Prayer was not just about faith. It was about finding meaning in suffering, about believing that this pain had a purpose, that God was watching, that reward awaited in heaven. For women especially, the figure of the Virgin Mary provided comfort. She had suffered too. She had watched her son die. She understood pain. Praying to Mary, asking for her intercession, gave women a sense of connection to someone who understood, and church services, when they could attend, provided light and warmth and community. We talked about Christmas services with all those candles, but even regular winter services offered a break from the isolation of home. A chance to see other people, to hear music, even simple church music, to be part of something larger than your own suffering. But I want to be honest about something. Sometimes none of this was enough. Sometimes the darkness and the cold and the hunger and the exhaustion were too much. We have records of people experiencing what we might now call nervous breakdowns during winter, periods where they simply could not function, where the weight of everything crushed them. For women, this was especially dangerous because they could not afford to stop functioning. If woman collapsed, who would feed the children? Who would tend the fire? The household depended on her continued labor, so women pushed through.
They forced themselves to keep going even when they felt like they could not, and the cost of that, the psychological and physical cost, must have been enormous.
There is a phenomenon that historians have documented in some regions called winter hibernation. Not literal hibernation, but something close. Families, especially very poor families, would essentially minimize all activity during the worst months. They would stay in bed most of the time, only getting up once or twice a day to eat a small meal and tend the fire. This conserved energy, conserved food, conserved firewood, and it helped people survive when there was simply not enough of anything. Can you imagine spending weeks or months, mostly in bed, in the dark, in the cold, because moving around too much would mean using up resources you did not have? That is a level of deprivation that is hard for us to comprehend, and women had to manage this too. Had to make the decision about when to implement these extreme measures. Had to ration not just food but activity itself. Now let me
tell you about something that might surprise you. There was also joy in winter evenings, not constant joy, not abundant joy, but moments, small moments that mattered. Children playing games by the fire, simple games that require no equipment, riddles, songs, storytelling games where each person adds a line to a story. These moments of play and laughter, however brief, were essential. They reminded people that life was not only suffering, that there was still beauty and connection and love, even in the darkness. Couples might find rare moments of privacy after children were asleep. Physical intimacy was one of the few pleasures available that cost nothing, and emotional intimacy, the quiet conversations in the dark before sleep, those sustained marriages and families through impossible times. Women would sometimes gather for specific social activities. Spinning bees, where multiple women would bring their spinning to one house and work together. This was practical. Multiple people in one room meant only one fire to maintain, and everyone benefited from the warmth.
But it was also social. They could talk, share news, teach younger women skills. These gatherings were informal women's sea, communities, creating spaces of relative freedom and support. There were also festivals and observances throughout winter beyond Christmas. Candlemas on February 2nd, which marked the midpoint of winter and was celebrated with candles and light. This was psychologically important, a reminder that winter was half over, that spring was coming, that you had made it this far and could make it the rest of the way. Let me share something that really touches me. There are records of women making small treats for their families during winter. Not big feasts, not elaborate dishes, but small comforts. Saving a bit of honey to sweeten bread on a particularly hard day, making a special thin cake from precious flour, finding wild rose hips and making them into a tea that tasted different from the usual ale. These tiny acts of care, of trying to bring a moment of pleasure into relentless hardship, that was love. That was resistance against despair. And women taught their daughters these skills. Not just the practical skills of survival, but the emotional skills. How to find hope in hopeless situations, how to create small joys, how to support other women, how to endure. This knowledge passed from mother to daughter was as essential as knowing how to spin thread or preserve meat. But even with all these coping mechanisms, winter darkness took a toll. We can see it in the records. More people died in winter, and not just from cold or hunger or disease. Some deaths were from what we might now recognize as suicide or giving up. The will to survive can be worn down, and medieval winters did their best to wear it down. Yet most people held on. Most women held on. They found reasons to keep going. Children who needed them, communities that depended on them, faith that sustained them, and sheer stubbornness. The determination that they would not let winter win, that they would see spring again. One of the most powerful tools women had was looking forward, planning for spring, talking about what they would plant in the garden, what they would do when the weather warmed, what they would make when there was more food available again. This mental projection into the future, this refusal to believe that winter was all there was, this kept hope alive. And women were the keepers of this hope for their families. When children cried from cold or hunger, mothers would tell them about spring, about flowers and sunshine and fresh food, about running outside without layers of wool, about all the good things that were coming. Even if the mother herself was not sure she believed it, she said it for her children. She created hope for them even when she had little left for herself. This is heroism. This is courage. Not the flashy kind with swords and battles, the quiet kind, the everyday kind, the kind that gets up in the dark, tends the fire, cares for the children, does the work, and finds a way to go on day after day, week after week, month after month. But hope alone could not prevent every tragedy. As winter wore on and resources dwindled, some families faced crises that even the strongest will could not overcome. Illness struck weak bodies. Food ran out before spring arrived. Accidents happened, and when disaster came, it was women who had to manage it, who had to care for the sick,
who had to make impossible decisions about who ate and how much, who had to grieve losses while somehow keeping the rest of the family alive.
Those crisis moments reveal the true depth of women's strength and the terrible weight of their responsibilities.
That is what we need to explore.
The knock on the door comes at midnight, urgent, desperate. A neighbor's child is sick, burning with fever, struggling to breathe. The mother needs help, and who does she come to? The women, always the women. Because when crisis struck in medieval winter, when illness turned deadly, when death came knocking, it was women who stood between their families and disaster. Women who became nurses without training, doctors without degrees, and sometimes witnesses to losses that would break your heart. Let me tell you about a night in early February, year 1437. A woman named Catherine wakes to that knock. Her neighbor's 6-year-old son has what they call a winter fever, what we might recognize now as pneumonia. His breathing is labored, rattling. His skin is hot to the touch, but he is shivering uncontrollably. In our world, this child would get antibiotics and probably be fine. In Catherine's world, she has herbs, prayers, and hope. That is all. Catherine wraps herself against the cold and hurries to her neighbor's house. She brings what she has. Dried herbs that she harvested last summer.
Yarrow for fever, coltsfoot for the cough, chamomile for calm.
She knows how to make poultices.
NDTs.
She knows how to bring down a fever with cool cloths. She knows how to position a child to help them breathe easier. This knowledge was passed down from her mother, who learned it from her grandmother.
Generations of women teaching each other how to fight death with plants and prayer and persistence. But here is the brutal truth. Sometimes it was not enough. Sometimes children died anyway. Sometimes adults died. And women had to watch it happen, knowing they had done everything they could, and it still was not enough. Winter was the season of death. The cold weakened bodies already stressed by poor nutrition and constant labor. The close quarters meant disease spread rapidly. One person gets sick. Soon the whole family is sick, and there was nowhere to isolate, nowhere to quarantine. You all lived in one room, remember? You all breathed the same smoky air.
You all touched the same surfaces.
Disease came into your house, everyone was exposed. The most common killers were respiratory illnesses, what we now call pneumonia, bronchitis, influenza.
Medieval people called them agues, fevers, winter sickness.
They understood that these illnesses were dangerous. They understood that they spread from person to person. But they did not understand germs or bacteria or viruses. They thought bad air caused sickness. Miasma theory, they called it. So their preventions focused on keeping air fresh and bodies strong, which actually was not terrible reasoning given what they knew.
Fresh air is better than stale air, even if not for the reasons they thought.
Keeping bodies strong with good food and rest does help fight illness.
Even if they did not understand immune systems, medieval people were working with limited knowledge, but applying logic the best they could. Women were the primary caregivers for the sick. When someone fell ill, it was women who stayed up all night monitoring fevers. Women who changed sweat-soaked bedding. Women who made healing teas and broths. Women who decided when to call for the priest because the end was near. This was exhausting, emotional, often traumatic work. And women did it on top of all their other responsibilities.
The fire still needed tending. The other children still needed feeding. The household still needed managing.
Sickness did not give you a break from survival.
Let me talk about the herbs and remedies women used, because this
is fascinating. Medieval women were sophisticated herbalists. They had to be. There were no pharmacies, no doctors for common folk. If someone was sick, you treated them yourself or you watched them die.
Women maintained kitchen gardens specifically for medicinal plants. Feverfew for headaches and fevers, obviously for digestion and inflammation, mint for stomach troubles, willow bark for pain, which we now know contains the compound that becomes aspirin, elderberry for coughs and colds, garlic for infections, which actually does have antimicrobial properties. These women were using effective treatments, even if they did not understand the chemistry behind them. They also used honey extensively, which we now know has antibacterial properties. A spoonful of honey for coughs actually works. Honey on wounds helps prevent infection. Medieval women knew this through observation and experience. They knew what worked even if they could not explain why. But they also used treatments that did nothing or made things worse. Bloodletting was common. The belief that bad blood needed to be removed. This actually weakened sick people further. Some herbal preparations were toxic, good intent. Tian's wrong methods. The line between healing and harming was not always clear. And when treatments failed, when someone died despite everything, women carried the guilt. Did I give the right herbs? Did I pray hard enough? Should I have called for help sooner? This emotional burden, this sense of responsibility for outcomes you could not actually control, weighed heavily on medieval women. Let me tell you what happened when the worst occurred. When a child died, when a husband died, when anyone in the family died in winter,
The grief was intense, obviously, but it could not be the only emotion because survival required continued action. A widow in winter faced terrifying challenges. She had lost her partner, her co-worker, often the primary income earner, but the children still needed feeding. The Lord still demanded rent. The land still needed managing when spring came. So women grieved while also frantically figuring out how to survive. Some remarried quickly, not because they did not mourn, but because they needed a partner to work the land. Some took on male roles themselves, proving they were capable of managing farms alone. Some moved in with relatives, adding their labor to another household. When a child died, mothers grieved while still caring for surviving children. I cannot even imagine that pain, holding one child who has died while another living child needs you. Having to set aside your grief because if you collapse, everyone suffers. This is a level of strength I find almost incomprehensible. And here is something that makes it even harder. In medieval Christianity, death was not the end. It was a transition. But where you transitioned to mattered enormously. Heaven, purgatory, or hell. Children who died unbaptized were believed to go to limbo. Neither heaven nor hell, but separated from God. So when a baby was born sickly, when a child fell desperately ill, there was a race to baptize them before death. This was women's responsibility too. If a midwife or mother realized a baby was dying, she could perform emergency baptism herself. Just water and the right words. But the pressure of knowing your child's eternal soul depended on your quick action. Unimaginable stress. Women also prepared bodies for burial. When someone died, women washed the body, dressed it in the best clothes available, laid it out for viewing. This intimate, difficult, necessary work fell to women touching death, preparing your loved one for their final journey. Doing it with numb fingers in a freezing room while your own grief threatens to overwhelm you, and then somehow finding the strength to continue living. Let me share a detail that really haunts me. In very poor families, when food was running out and someone was dying, the sick person would sometimes refuse food. They would say they were not hungry, that they had already eaten, but everyone knew what was really happening. They were choosing to die faster so the living would have more food. Elderly people especially would do this. Give up their share so children might survive. This level of sacrifice, this conscious choice to die for others, happened in medieval winters. Not often, thank goodness, but it happened. Now, illness was not the only crisis women managed in winter. There were accidents, falls on ice, burns from fires, childbirth complications we discussed earlier, injuries from animals or tools, and there were mental health crises, people who became violent or suicidal from the strain. Women had to manage all of it, calm the panicked, restrain the dangerous, comfort the despairing. All while maintaining the household and keeping themselves functioning. And there were food crises, when you calculated wrong, when the harvest was worse than expected, when you lost stores to spoilage or theft or fire. When you reached late February and realized the food would not last until spring, what do? Who gets to eat? How much? These decisions fell primarily on women because women managed food distribution. Can you imagine having to decide which child gets a full portion and which gets less? Having to watch your children go hungry and know you could do nothing about it. Some women gave their own food to their children, slowly starving themselves to keep their children alive a little longer. Some women begged, going to wealthier neighbors, to the Lord's Hall, to the church, asking for any charity they could get. The shame of begging, the desperation that overcame pride. This was women's reality in crisis winters. But here is what amazes me. Most families made it through. Most women found a way. They borrowed from neighbors, promising to repay at harvest. They foraged for anything edible, even in frozen landscapes. They caught fish if there was open water. They ate small game if they could. They stretched grain impossibly thin, making watery porridge that barely qualified as food, but kept bodies alive. They did whatever it took, and communities helped each other. This is important. Yes, there were selfish people. Yes, some hoarded while others starved. But there were also generous people who shared when they barely had enough themselves. Women especially seem to help other women. A neighbor who secretly leaves a loaf of bread on your doorstep. A relative who takes in your children so you have fewer mouths to feed. A friend who shares her healing herbs without expecting payment. These acts of kindness, these moments of solidarity, saved lives. Medieval charity was different from modern charity. It was personal, direct. You helped people you knew, your neighbors, your community. The idea that strangers owed each other nothing did not quite exist. You were part of a community, and that meant obligations. If someone was truly desperate, you helped if you could. Not because you were especially noble, but because next winter you might be the desperate one. Women organized much of this informal charity. They knew who was struggling. They knew who had extra.
They facilitated exchanges and support. This was another form of invisible
Community management, social infrastructure.
Women built and maintained the networks that kept villages alive. Let me tell you about the concept of neighborliness in medieval times. It was not just being friendly. It was an obligation, an expectation. You helped your neighbors and they helped you. Women embodied this, helping with births, caring for the sick, sharing food, teaching skills.
This mutual support system was essential for winter survival. But even with all this, some winters were worse than others.
Plague years, famine years, years when the crisis was too big for communities to absorb, when charity could not stretch far enough, when too many people needed help and too few could provide it.
Those years left scars, entire villages diminished, families destroyed, survivors traumatized. And the next winter the fear was worse, because everyone remembered what could happen.
Women carried these memories.
Remembered which winter their first child died.
which winter they nearly starved, which winter their mother succumbed to fever.
Next winter.
Made them more cautious, more anxious, more determined to do better this time.
But memories also carried hope. Remembered winters that they survived, problems they overcame, strength they did not know they had until they needed it. Women told stories of past winters to remind themselves and their daughters, "We have survived before. We will survive again." This resilience, this refusal to give up even when everything seemed hopeless is what I want you to take away from this. Women faced impossible situations and found ways through. Not because they were superhuman, not because they had special powers, but because they had no choice, and they chose to keep fighting anyway. Yet, fighting winter's battles came at a cost. The toll on women's bodies, minds, and spirits accumulated over years. What did that long-term impact look like? How did a lifetime of winter survival shape medieval women? And what happened to those who could not bear the burden? Who were particularly vulnerable? Understanding the full price women paid for survival. That is what we need to explore next. The widows, the elderly women, the most vulnerable carrying the heaviest loads. There was a kind of fear that gripped medieval communities every winter. Not just the fear of cold or hunger, though those were real, but the fear of what happened when the structure of a household collapsed. When a husband died, when suddenly a woman found herself alone, responsible for everything, with winter stretching ahead and no partner to share the burden. This was the widow's winter, and it was both more dangerous and more powerful than you might imagine. Let me introduce you to Alice. She is 42 years old, which makes her older than most women in her village. She's been married for 24 years. She has 6 children, though only 4 are still living. And 1 week ago, in early January of the year 1453, her husband Thomas died. A fall on the ice hit his head, gone within hours. And now Alice is alone with 4 children, a farm that needs managing, and 2 more months of winter ahead. In our modern world, we think of widows as tragic figures, helpless, dependent, needing rescue. But medieval widows, they were complicated. Vulnerable, yes, but also potentially powerful in ways that married women could never be. Because here is the thing about medieval law and custom. A widow woman had almost no legal rights. She could not own property independently. She could not make contracts, and she could not represent herself in court. Everything was in her husband's name, under his authority. But a widow became a legal person. She could own property, make decisions, run businesses. For the first time in her life, she had agency. But that agency came at a terrible price because she also had all the responsibility. Let me walk you through what Alice faces in this first week after Thomas's death. First, the immediate crisis.
Thomas's body needs to be prepared for burial at his women's work. As we discussed, Alice and her female neighbors wash his body, dress him in his best tunic, lay him.
The burial happens quickly because it is winter and bodies do not keep. The priest performs the service. The village gathers. And then everyone goes back to their own survival, and Alice is left to figure out hers. The farm. Thomas was plowing, planting, managing the heavy labor. Alice helped, of course, but now she is solely responsible. And it is January. The spring planting is weeks away, but there is still work. Animals to tend, fences to maintain, tools to prepare. Her oldest son is 15, helpful but not yet fully capable. Her oldest daughter is 12, already doing women's work, but she is still a child. The younger children are 10 and 7. Everyone will have to do more, much more, the rent. Alice owes the Lord rent on this land. Rent that was calculated assuming 2 adults working the property. She still owes it whether she can pay it or not. If she fails, she could lose the land, the house, everything. So she has to produce as much as Thomas, and she produced together, but with only herself as the adult labor. The math does not work, but she has to make it work anyway. The food stores. Thomas and Alice planned their winter food based on feeding 6 people. Now they are down to 5, which should mean the food lasts longer. But Thomas was eating more because he was doing the heaviest labor. And now Alice has to do that labor, which means she needs more food too. And the children are growing. They need more.
So actually the food situation has not improved. It might have gotten worse. The protection. This is something we have not talked about much, but it mattered. A woman alone was vulnerable to theft, to harassment, to PR.
Editorial men who saw a widow as an opportunity. Alice needs to make it clear that she has community support, that she is not isolated, that harming her would have consequences. She needs male relatives or neighbors to visibly help her, to show that she is protected. This is not paranoia. This is reality. So in the first week after Thomas's death, while grieving, while comforting her traumatized children, while managing her own shock and fear, Alice has to figure out all of this. She has to take inventory of what she has, plan how to survive until spring, negotiate with neighbors for help, assert her rights to the land, protect her family, and somehow find the strength to get up every morning and do the work.
But here is where medieval law gets interesting.
Because in some ways, Alice now has more power than she ever did as a married woman. She can make decisions about the farm without asking anyone's permission. If she wants to sell something, she can. If she wants to hire laborers, she can. If she needs to take someone to court over a debt or a dispute, she can represent herself.
Married women could not do any of this.
Widows could. There are records of medieval widows running successful businesses, farms, yes, but also shops, taverns, workshops. Women who took over their husband's trade and continued it, sometimes expanding it. Women who proved they were just as capable as men at management and decision-making. The difference was that as wives, their capabilities were hidden behind their husband's legal identity. As widows, those capabilities became visible and recognized. Let me tell you about a real medieval widow from the manor records. Her name was Marjorie, and she ran a farm in Lincolnshire in the late 1400s. When her husband died, the Lord's steward assumed she would remarry or give up the land. But Marjorie appeared at the manor court and successfully argued that she could manage the property. She provided references from neighbors. She showed that she understood the agricultural work. She negotiated a fair rent. And for the next 12 years, she ran that farm, paid her rent, raised her children, and proved everyone wrong who doubted her. Stories like Marjorie's were not common, but they were not rare either. Medieval records are full of widows managing properties, running businesses, making NG court appearances. What does this tell us? That women were capable all along. They had the skills and knowledge.
They just were not allowed to demonstrate it while married. But let us be honest. For every success story like Marjorie, there were other stories that ended badly. Widows who could not manage alone, who lost their land, who had to remarry quickly to someone they did not choose because survival required it, who watched their children go hungry because there was simply not enough. The vulnerability was real.
Elderly widows had it worst. If you were young and healthy, you might remarry.
You might attract a new husband who wanted your land or your labor. But if you were old, if you were past childbearing age, if you were weak or sick, who would marry you? And how would you survive? Some elderly widows moved in with adult children. This could work if the children were prosperous and kind, but it could also be miserable. Being dependent on your children, having no authority in their household, being seen as a burden. Some cultures revered the elderly. Medieval Europe did not particularly. Old women were often seen as useless, as consumers of resources without contributing value. This was the cruel calculation of a subsistence society. Other elderly widows tried to survive alone, doing what work they could, spinning, always spinning, because that was something you could do even with failing eyesight and weak hands, begging sometimes, taking charity from the church or wealthier neighbors, living on the absolute edge of survival, one bad winter, one serious illness, and they were gone. And here is something dark that we need to acknowledge. Elderly women, particularly widows, were vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. When your society sees old women as burdens, when resources are scarce, when people need someone to blame for misfortune, who becomes the target? The woman who lives alone, who knows healing herbs, who is different, who has no husband to protect her. Accusations of witchcraft could strip a woman of her property, her reputation, even her life. This peaked in the early modern period, but the seeds were planted in the medieval mindset. Old women were convenient scapegoats. But let me tell you about the strength of these women, because even in the most vulnerable positions, they found ways to survive. They built networks with other widows.
Hey, supported each other. A woman who had a little extra would share with one who had nothing. They would take turns hosting each other, sharing firewood and food. They would watch each other's backs against predatory men or unfair treatment. This widow solidarity was crucial. Some widows became respected figures in their communities despite the challenges.
Women who had raised large families, who had survived multiple winters, who had accumulated knowledge and wisdom. These women became informal advisors, sources of practical knowledge. The person you went to when you needed to know how to treat a sick child or preserve food or deal with a difficult landlord. They had authority born from experience.
Let me share a detail from medieval wills that I find touching.
Many widows, when they made their wills, left specific bequests to other women. A spinning wheel to a daughter or a niece, a recipe book if they had one, specific herbs or seeds from their garden. These were not valuable in monetary terms, but they were valuable as knowledge transfer, as connection, as one woman saying to another, "I am giving you the tools to survive and thrive as I did."
There were also religious options for
Or widows joining a convent if you could afford it. Some convents accepted older widows, women who wanted spiritual community and security. You brought your property to the convent, and in exchange you got housing, food, and a community of women. For some widows this was salvation, a way to have dignity and purpose in old age. But convents were not open to everyone. You needed some wealth to enter. Poor widows had no such option.
Now let us return to Alice. It is now late February. She has survived 2 months as a widow, barely. Her oldest son has been doing men's work and it is aging him fast. Her daughter has taken on more household responsibilities.
The younger children are helping as they can.
Alice herself is exhausted in ways she has never been before. Thomas did more than she realized.
She misses him desperately, but she is also discovering her own strength.
She has negotiated help from neighbors. A man who will assist with the spring plowing in exchange for some of their harvest. A widow down the road who trades spinning for eggs. Her brother who lives in the next village who has promised to check on her regularly. She has built a support network, and she has proven
Herself and the community that she can manage this farm. But she is also considering remarriage, not because she wants to. She is still grieving, but because practically she might need to.
a husband would mean another adult worker. It would mean protection. It would mean her children would have a father figure.
The pressure to remarry is intense.
The Lord Steward has already suggested it.
Neighbors have hinted at possible matches, and Alice is torn between wanting independence and needing security. This is the widow's dilemma.
You finally have legal agency. You can make your own decisions.
But the practical realities of survival might force you to give up that agency by remarrying. And if you remarry, you go back to being legally invisible. Your new husband controls everything again.
It is a cruel choice. Some widows chose independence anyway. They valued freedom over security. They found ways to survive alone even when it was harder. They built lives on their own terms. These women were remarkable.
Not superhuman, not wealthy or specially gifted, just determined. They refused to give up their hard-won authority. They paid the price in harder labor and greater risk, but they chose.
Yet.
Others remarried and found happiness. A second marriage could be good based on mutual respect and practical partnership, rather than youthful romance.
Some second husbands valued their wives' experience and capabilities.
Some marriages were true partnerships where both people's contributions were recognized.
It was possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. What I want you to understand is that widowhood in medieval winter was complicated, dangerous, but empowering, vulnerable, but potentially freeing. These women lived in the contradictions. They made impossible choices. They survived when the odds were against them, and they did it with grace and strength that demands our respect. The stories of widows, of elderly women, of the most vulnerable surviving the hardest times. These stories remind us that survival is not just about physical strength. It is about adaptability, community, determination, the willingness to keep going even when everything seems impossible. But as winter finally started releasing its grip, as the days began to lengthen and the worst cold started easing, another kind of challenge emerged. Not the crisis of survival, but the challenge of hope, of believing. That spring was really coming. Of finding the energy for one more push when you were already beyond exhausted. That late winter, early spring transition when you were not out of danger, but could see the possibility of safety, required its own kind of strength, and women had to summon it from reserves they did not know they still had. Late February, you wake up one morning and notice something different. The light. It is coming through your window earlier than yesterday. Not much earlier, maybe just a few minutes. But you notice, and for the first time in months, you let yourself think the forbidden thought, maybe winter is ending. Maybe we are going to make it. But here is the cruel thing about late winter. Hope can be just as dangerous as despair.
Because you are not safe yet, not even close.
And this final stretch, when you can almost see the finish line but have not reached it, this might be the hardest part of all. Let me take you into the mind of a woman named Emma. She is 33 years old.
She has survived this winter, barely. Her family is intact. No one has died, no one has fallen seriously ill. By medieval standards, this is success. but Emma is running on empty.
Food stores that seemed adequate in November are now critically low.
The firewood pile is almost gone.
Every piece of clothing in the house is worn thin from months of constant use. And most significantly, Emma herself is exhausted beyond anything she has ever experienced. This exhaustion is not just physical, though her body aches in ways that will never fully heal. It is mental, emotional, spiritual. She has been making life and death decisions for months. She has been vigilant every moment. She has carried the weight of her family's survival with no break, no relief, no rest. And now, when she should feel hopeful, all she feels is the bone-deep terror that something will go wrong at the last moment, that they will fail when they're so close to succeeding. This late winter anxiety was real. Medieval people understood that this was the most dangerous time. They even had a name for the late winter food shortage, the hungry gap. That period between when your stored food runs out and when the first spring crops become available. For many families, the hungry gap meant genuine starvation, not hunger. Starvation.
Bodies beginning to consume themselves. Children becoming weak and hot.
Eyes. Adults making choices about who gets the last scraps of food. Emma's family has reached the hungry gap. The grain is almost gone. They have been stretching it thinner and thinner, making porridge that is more water than grain. The salted meat from Martinmas was consumed weeks ago. They are down to root vegetables that are getting soft and sprouted, some dried peas, a few eggs if the chickens are laying, which they often are not in late winter because they too are stressed and underfed. So Emma does what women have always done in desperate times. She forages. Even though the landscape is still frozen, even though there is snow on the ground, she knows where to look. Under the leaf litter in the forest, she might find edible roots. Tree bark can be stripped and the inner layer eaten, though it tastes terrible and barely provides nutrition. She looks for early shoots of plants brave enough to emerge before the worst cold has passed. Anything, everything, and she begs, not openly because pride matters even when you are starving, but she goes to slightly wealthier neighbors and asks if they have any work she could do in exchange for food. Asks if they need help with anything.
Ho!
Pest, they will offer something. Some do. Others turn her away because they too are struggling.
This is not cruelty. This is everyone being pushed to their limits. But here is what makes late winter particularly psychologically brutal. You can see that spring is coming. The days are getting longer. The sun, when it appears, has a different quality. Warmer, more substantial. You can smell change in the air. And this makes the waiting almost unbearable. When winter seemed endless, you could settle into a kind of numb endurance. But now you're counting days, calculating how long until you can plant, how long until the first greens are edible, how long until this nightmare ends, and the weather toys with you. You get a warm day, a genuinely warm day. No melts.
You think this is it, spring is here, and then boom, another cold snap. More snow. Temperatures plummet again. And you have to find the strength to endure more when you thought you were done enduring. This is what broke some people. Not the initial cold of December, but false hope of late February and March. Let me tell you about Candlemas, February 2nd. This was a major festival in the medieval calendar, and it had deep significance for winter survival. Candlemas marked the midpoint of winter. Officially, you were halfway through. The church would bless candles, symbolizing light returning to the world. People would process with candles. It was a festival of hope, of light, of the promise that winter could not last forever. But Candlemas also had a practical dimension. It was a check-in point. Families would assess their stores. Do we have enough to make it the rest of the way?
Medieval wisdom said you should have half your firewood and half your food remaining at Candlemas. If you had less, you were in trouble. If you had more, you might relax slightly. This practical accounting combined with the religious symbolism made Candlemas psychologically important. It gave people permission to hope, or it confirmed their worst fears. Emma's family barely had a quarter of their supplies left at Candlemas. They have been rationing heavily since then. Every day is a calculation. Every meal is planned down to the last crumb. Emma lies awake at night doing math. If we eat this much per day, we can last until this date. But will spring actually come by that date? What if it is a late spring? What if the cold continues?
These questions haunted medieval women in late winter because they had no weather forecasts, no scientific predictions, just experience and observation. Watching the sky, noting when certain birds returned, tracking when the ice on the pond started to thin, learning to read nature's signals, and hoping those signals were reliable. Women also prepared for spring during this time, even while still managing winter survival. Seeds needed to be checked.
Were they still viable? Tools needed to be prepared. Hose sharpened. Rakes repaired.
Plans needed to be made. What to plant where, what had worked last year, and what had not. This forward planning, this investment in a future they were not certain they would reach, was an act of faith, an act of defiance against despair. Let me share something that really illustrates the tension of late winter. There are records of medieval communities having spring festivals before spring actually arrived. Pre-spring celebrations. Why? To summon spring, to encourage it, to psychologically prepare for the transition. These were not big festivals like Christmas, but there would be gatherings, songs about spring. Children would play games about planting and growth. It was part practical preparation and part magical thinking. If we act like spring is coming, maybe it will come. Women organized many of these activities, teaching children spring songs, planning the first plantings, talking about what fresh food would taste like. This was not trivial. This was survival psychology, giving people something to look forward to, keeping hope alive when exhaustion wanted to extinguish. But the work never stopped. Remember, women were still doing all their regular winter work: spinning, cooking, tending fires, caring for children, managing households, plus now adding preparation for spring, plus foraging for food because stores were low, plus dealing with their own exhaustion and the exhaustion of everyone around them. The burden was crushing, and here is something we need to talk about. Late winter was when relationships frayed, when people who had been patient for months suddenly could not take it anymore, when small irritations became big fights, when the stress of survival made people turn on each other. Women often bore the brunt of this. Husbands frustrated by their own helplessness might become angry, children stressed and angry might become difficult, and women had to absorb all that anger and frustration while managing their own. Had to be the emotional stabilizers while they themselves were falling apart. Some women broke during late winter. The accumulated stress was too much. They stopped functioning, could not get out of bed, could not make decisions, just shut down. And when that happened, the whole household was in crisis because everything depended on the woman's labor. This was recognized in medieval communities. Other women would step in, take over the household temporarily, care for the children, keep things running until the woman could recover, if she could recover. Because that is another hard truth. Some women did not bounce back. Some carried the trauma of winter survival for the rest of their lives. Developed what we might now recognize as PTSD or chronic depression, became unable to fully function. Medieval society did not have good ways to help these women. Often they just struggled on, doing the minimum to survive, never quite recovering their former strength. But most women did recover, found reserves they did not know they had, kept pushing even when pushing seemed impossible. And slowly, gradually, unmistakably, spring did come. Not all at once, not with fanfare, but in small increments. A bird on a tree, a blade of grass, the ice on the pond cracking and melting. Each sign was celebrated, each indicator that winter was truly ending, was proof that they had survived. Emma watches for these signs obsessively. She checks the garden plot every day, looking for any hint of green. She listens for returning birds. She touches the soil, testing if it is starting to fall. And one day in early March she finds it. A single crocus pushing up through the half-frozen ground, blooming purple against the brown earth. She cries. Just stands there in her worn cloak with her chapped hands and her exhausted body. And she cries because she made it. Her family made it. They survived, but survival came at a cost. Let me be very clear about this. Medieval women who survived winter were not unchanged by the experience. Their bodies bore the marks. Malnutrition during winter affected bone density, teeth, overall health. The physical labor took a toll that accumulated over years. Women aged fast. A woman of 40 might look 60. De-winter survival wore people down. And emotionally, the scars ran deep. The losses, the close calls, the moments of terror when it seemed like they would not make it, these stayed with you. Women carried them, remembered them, and used them because remembering meant being better prepared next time, meant taking survival seriously, meant never being complacent about winter. So when we talk about women surviving winter, we are not talking about emerging unchanged. We are talking about survival that cost pieces of themselves, health, innocence, trust in the world. But also talking about gaining things, strength, resilience, knowledge, community bonds forged in shared hardship. These women were transformed by winter, hardened, but also made more aware of their own capacity for endurance. As spring finally truly arrived, as the ice melted and the world started greening and the first fresh food became available, women faced a new challenge. Not survival exactly, but recovery. Rebuilding, processing what they had been through and preparing, always preparing for the next winter. Because winter would come again. It always did. And everything they had learned, everything they had suffered with, would need to be applied again. The cycle never ended until it did. Until spring came and brought with it not just survival, but the promise of something more, something better. The question was, could they believe it? After everything, could they trust that hope was real? That is where our journey ends, where their strength took them. What medieval women's winter survival teaches us today. That is what we explore in our final chapter. Spring arrived. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but it came to the ground.
Shoots pushed through soil, birds returned.
And across medieval Europe, millions of women who had carried impossible burdens through the darkest months finally allowed themselves to breathe. They had done it.
They had kept their families alive. They had made it to another spring. And in that moment, before the next cycle of work began, before they had to start preparing for the next winter, there was a pause.
A moment to realize what they had accomplished, what they had endured, what they had proven about human strength and resilience, and the power of simply refusing to give up. I want to spend these final moments with you, reflecting on what these women's stories mean. Not just as history, not just as interesting tales from the past, but as lessons for us today. Because I believe these medieval women have something to teach us, something we desperately need to hear. First, let me tell you what happened when spring finally came. The change was not instant, but it was real.
Women could go outside without wrapping in multiple layers. They could work in the garden without numb fingers.
They could see green things growing, smell earth instead of smoke, feel sun on their faces without it being a brief, precious moment stolen from the cold.
The first fresh greens were eaten almost reverently.
Tender shoots of plants, early herbs.
The first time you tasted something fresh after months of preserved food, it was transcendent.
Children who'd been cooped up inside for months could run and play outside. Their laughter, which had been muted by cold and darkness, became loud and joyful again.
Families that had been pressed together in one room for survival could spread out, take space, breathe easier. The tension that had built up over the winter began to release.
But let me be honest about something. Spring also meant accounting, looking at what winter had cost. Some families were missing members, children or elderly who did not survive.
Every village counted its losses. Every community grieved. And women who had done so much of the care work, who had witnessed so much of the suffering, carried those losses heavily.
Spring also meant work, a different kind of work, but exhausting nonetheless. Fields had to be prepared and planted, gardens established, repairs made to buildings damaged by winter weather. The cycle of labor never truly stopped, but at least spring work had hope attached to it. You were planting for the future, building towards something, not just surviving day to day. Women threw themselves into spring work with energy born from relief. The spinning would continue. It always continued. But now they could take breaks, go outside, see progress happening in real time as seeds sprouted and grew. There was joy in watching something flourish after months of watching things diminish and deplete. And throughout spring and summer and autumn, women would remember. They would think about the winter past. Use those memories to prepare for the winter coming. This was not trauma exactly. This was practical wisdom. Remember when we ran out of food in late February? We need more stored this year. Remember when the firewood was low? We need to gather more. Remember when that child got sick and we did not have the right herbs? We need to stock up. Memory became strategy.
Experience became knowledge. Survival became skill. Now let me tell you what I think we can learn from these women. What their stories teach us about resilience, about community, about what it means to be strong. First lesson: strength is not about never being tired. It is about keeping going even when you are exhausted. These women were tired every single day.
Bone tired, soul tired. But they kept moving, kept working, kept caring because they had to. And in that necessity, they found strength they did not know they possessed. Modern culture sometimes acts like strength means never struggling, never being weak. But that is not strength. That is fantasy. Real strength is struggling and persisting anyway. Second lesson, community is survival. These women could not have made it alone. They needed each other. Networks of women supporting women, sharing knowledge, sharing resources, taking care of each other's children, helping in crisis. This was not optional.
This was essential. And I think about our modern world where individualism is celebrated and asking for help is seen as weakness.
Medieval women would find that bizarre.
Of course you need help. Of course you cannot do it alone. No one can. Survival is a community project. Third lesson, invisible labor is still labor.
These women's work was essential.
Without them, civilization would have collapsed. But it was invisible, unrecorded,
Undervalued. The cooking, the spinning, the childcare, the emotional labor of keeping families functional.
all of it crucial, all of it ignored by history until modern scholars started looking more carefully.
This should make us think about whose labor is invisible in our society, whose contributions go unacknowledged, and how we can do better at recognizing and valuing that work. Fourth lesson, preparation matters. These women survived because we prepared obsessively, carefully. They knew that autumn work determined winter survival, that planning ahead was the difference between life and death. Modern life can make us complacent. We have grocery stores and central heating and social safety nets, but those systems can fail.
The people who have skills, who have knowledge, who have prepared, those are the people who make it through. There is wisdom in learning from these women about preparation, about not taking abundance for granted. Fifth lesson, women have always been the backbone of civilization. Always. They have done the work that kept everything running. Raised the children who became the next generation, maintained the knowledge that preserved culture, built the communities that held societies together. But history books focused on kings and wars and male achievements. The women were footnotes.
This was not because women were less important. It was because their importance was so constant, so essential that it became invisible like air. You do not think about air until you cannot breathe. Medieval women were the air that kept medieval society breathing.
And modern women play the same role in our society. We need to see it, acknowledge it, value it properly.
Sixth lesson, resilience is not the same as being okay.
These women survived. They were resilient, but they were not okay. They carried trauma. They bore physical and emotional stuff.
They were changed by their experiences, and that is regarding our resilience. Not bouncing back unchanged, but being transformed by hardship and still finding a way forward. We need to stop expecting people to be fine after difficult experiences. Resilience can coexist with pain, with damage, with being fundamentally changed. That is okay. That is human.
Seventh lesson, hope is a choice.
Winter could have broken these women's spirits. The darkness, the cold, the hunger, the fear. It was all enough to justify giving up, but they chose hope. They chose to believe spring would come. They chose to keep trying, not because they were certain of success,
but because the alternative was unacceptable. This is powerful. Hope is not naive optimism. Hope is the stubborn decision to keep moving forward, even when the odds seem impossible. These women teach us how to do that. Let me bring this back to one specific woman. Our friend Emma, who cried at the sight of a crocus. That moment encapsulates everything I have been trying to say. She made it, but survival cost her, changed her. She will never be the same person she was before that winter. And that is okay. She is stronger now, wiser, more aware of her own capacity. She knows what she can endure. She can survive things that once would have seemed impossible. That knowledge will carry her through every future challenge. And here is something beautiful. Emma will pass that knowledge to her daughter. She will teach her how to preserve food, how to tend a fire, how to spin thread, how to care for the sick. But more than skills, she will teach her resilience. She will teach her that women are strong, that they can survive terrible things, that they are essential, that their work matters. And her daughter will teach her daughters, and the chain continues. This is how knowledge survives, how culture perpetuates. Through women teaching women, through generations of mothers saying to daughters, this is how we survive. This is how we endure. This is who we are. Now I know some of you might be thinking, but we do not face medieval winters. We have heat and food security and modern medicine. Why does this matter? And that is fair. You're right. Most of us will never face the kind of survival challenge these women faced. But we face our own challenges, our own winters,
metaphorical if not literal, times of hardship, periods of struggle, moments when we feel like we cannot go on.
And these women show us how. They show us that you can be exhausted and still function, that you can be scared and still be brave, that you can be changed by trauma and still find joy. That community matters, that preparation matters, that invisible work matters, that women's strength has always been real, even when it was not acknowledged. These lessons transcend time periods. They are human lessons, survival lessons, lessons about what it means to endure and overcome. I also think there is something specifically powerful about learning from women's history. For so long, history was just the story of men, kings and generals and philosophers and inventors. All important, but not the whole picture. Not even close. By learning about medieval women, about their labor and their struggles and their victories, we are recovering a lost history. We are saying these lives mattered. These stories deserve to be told. These women were not background characters. They were the protagonists of their own lives and the essential support system for everyone else's lives. And for women today, there is something empowering about knowing that your grandmothers went back dozens of generations on, that they faced impossible odds and overcame them, that they worked harder than anyone should have to work and did it with grace, that they built the world you inherited. You come from a line of survivors, of warriors, not the kind with swords, but the kind with calloused hands and determined hearts and refusal to give up. That is your heritage, that is your birthright, and you can draw strength from that knowledge. For everyone, regardless of gender, these stories remind us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things. These were not noble women, not queens or saints, just regular people living regular lives. But what they accomplished was remarkable. They kept civilization going through its darkest, coldest, hardest centuries. They did it without recognition, without reward, without anyone telling them they were heroes. They did it because it needed doing. And that's the most heroic thing of all. So, as we close this journey through medieval winter, as we step back from the cold and the darkness and the endless labor, I want you to take something with you. Remember these women. Remember their strength. Remember their resilience. Remember their community.
Their hope. And when you face your own winters, your own hard times, your own moments of despair, remember that you come from people who survived impossible things. You have that strength in you. It has always been there, passed down through generations, waiting for you to access it. Medieval women survived winter after winter after winter. They did it with courage and creativity and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. They did it together, supporting each other, building networks of care that sustained communities. They did it knowing that their work was essential, even if it was invisible. They did it carrying more burdens than any person should have to carry. And they did it anyway, because they were extraordinary, ordinary women just like the women today, just like you. Thank you for taking this journey with me, for sitting with these stories, for learning about these incredible women who lived hundreds of years ago, but whose strength echoes through time. Their lives mattered, their work mattered, their survival mattered. And by remembering them, by telling their stories, we honor them. We say you are not forgotten. Your struggles were real. Your victories were remarkable. And we are grateful. These medieval winters and the women who survived them have so much more to teach us. There are more stories to tell, more lives to explore, more lessons to learn from the past that can illuminate our present. And I would be honored to continue sharing those stories with you. So if these tales moved you, if they've made you think, if they inspired you, I hope you will stay with me for what comes next. There are always more stories, always more women whose lives deserve to be remembered and celebrated. Until then, stay curious, stay strong, and remember, you come from survivors. That strength is in you. Winter always comes, but spring always follows. That is the promise, that is the hope. That is what these medieval women knew in their bones and passed down through the generations. And now you know it too.
Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about these stories. And thank you for understanding that history is not just dates and battles.
It is people.
Real people with real lives and real struggles and real triumphs. These women were real, and they were remarkable. Never forget.